Good evening. Imagine the sky just before a storm, clouds gathering like curtains over the world, thunder simmering, the air thick with electricity you can almost taste. That is where the story of Olympus begins, not with peace or order, but with hunger, fear, and a father who thought the best way to keep power was to eat his own children. Cronus, Titan of time, had been warned by prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him. His solution was grotesque but effective. He swallowed each child at birth. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon all slid into the endless night of his belly, trapped in living silence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fate in Greek mythology has a way of slipping through cracks no matter how tightly sealed. Rhea, Cronus's wife, weary of losing child after child, tricked him at last. She swaddled a stone in cloth and handed it over as if it were their newborn. Cronus swallowed without a glance, proof that paranoia and carelessness make a terrible combination. The real child, Zeus, was spirited away to Crete, hidden in a cave where the clashing cymbals of the Curetes drowned out his infant cries so Cronus would not hear. Zeus grew in secret, fed by the goat Amalthea, whose milk nurtured him to strength. It's worth pausing here. Greek myth often ties survival not to armies but to mothers, animals, and quiet caretakers. While Cronus clung to the cycle of devouring time, Zeus was raised in wilderness and nurtured by loyalty, a pattern that would define him. When he was grown, he confronted his father, slicing open Cronus's stomach and freeing his siblings. Out poured Hestia, Hera, Demeter, Poseidon, and Hades, alive but scarred by their strange imprisonment. A family, yes, but one born in trauma, forged in betrayal. The Olympians were not a polished dynasty. They were survivors of parental violence. That family, bruised, mismatched, and eternally quarrelsome, waged a 10-year war against the Titans, a battle of thunder, stone, and cosmic upheaval. They emerged victorious, exiling the Titans to Tartarus. The world was divided. Zeus claimed the sky, Poseidon the sea, Hades the underworld. The earth was left as common ground, though Zeus's word would often tip the balance. On paper, it was balance. In reality, it was a powder keg. As ruler of the heavens, Zeus was supposed to embody justice, oaths, and cosmic order. He wielded the thunderbolt crafted by the Cyclopes as his ultimate weapon, a symbol of authority. Yet here's where the paradox sets in. The god who held the fate of mortals and immortals alike couldn't control himself. Imagine a Supreme Court justice who can transform into a swan to seduce a girl, then pass judgment on the morals of humanity. That's Zeus, protector of law by day, serial boundary, violator by night. His reputation for seduction wasn't exaggerated, it was a defining trait. Leda found herself visited by a swan, Europa by a bull, Danae by golden rain. Mortal women, nymphs, even goddesses all fell into his orbit, though fell often means coerced, tricked, or trapped. Greek mythology rarely pretends this was romance, it was raw divine appetite. And from these liaisons sprang demigods, heroes, and figures who shaped myth itself. Perseus, Heracles, Helen of Troy. It was as though Zeus's inability to restrain himself scattered seeds of story across the ancient world. Yet the myths didn't only glorify him, they mocked him. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, delighted in painting Zeus as a blustering adulterer, Olympus's eternal embarrassment. Even ancient audiences laughed at the king of gods sneaking around in animal disguises, but they also feared him. Thunder was his voice, lightning his anger. Farmers, sailors, and kings sacrificed bulls and built temples to keep his temper at bay. To anger Zeus was to invite ruin, to please him was to gain fortune. He was both tyrant and saviour, and that tension made him magnetic. Still, Zeus was not only lust and fury, he was also the great referee of Olympus. He upheld sacred oaths, punished perjury, and enforced xenia, the sacred law of hospitality that bound Greek society. To betray a guest under your roof was to risk his wrath. To violate an oath sworn in his name was to invite punishment. These cultural values mattered deeply to the Greeks, and Zeus, despite his personal chaos, stood as their divine enforcer. When Odysseus delays his return by angering Poseidon, it is Zeus who ultimately permits his homecoming. When kings forgot humility, it was Zeus who hurled down a reminder from the sky. He was not fair, but he was final. His contradictions made him dangerous to love and impossible to ignore. To Hera, his wife and sister, he was tormentor and betrayer. To mortals, he was both a giver of law and a breaker of boundaries. To his children, he was an absent father whose fame eclipsed his care. Yet, no matter his flaws, Zeus held Olympus together by sheer gravity. In art, he appears enthroned, bearded, radiating authority, lightning bolt in hand, eagle at his side. His very image whispered dominance, even as his behavior undercut it. The ancient Greeks understood something modern audiences still wrestle with. Power doesn't require consistency. A ruler may be unstable, selfish, even scandalous, but if he commands the storm, if he alone can summon rain or drought, no one dares ignore him. Zeus embodied this paradox. He was the guardian of order who thrived in disorder, the arbiter of justice who lived without it. The myths make us laugh at him, yes, but they also remind us why mortals trembled when thunder rolled over the mountains. And so, the dysfunctional family of Olympus began with a thunderclap. The children of a devouring father rose from his belly to become the new rulers of the cosmos. At their head sat Zeus, ruler, seducer, judge, tyrant, protector. The Greeks built temples to him across their cities, from Olympia to Dodona, where his voice was said to whisper through the rustling of oak leaves. His worship was vast, his presence constant, but behind every prayer, every sacrifice, lurked unease, the knowledge that the king of the gods had no boundaries. Zeus was the storm, beautiful, terrifying, and never truly on anyone's side. Hera, the fury behind the throne. If Zeus was the thundercloud looming over Olympus, Hera was the lightning strike that followed. Not always predictable, but always sharp. She was queen of the gods, the goddess of marriage, family, and childbirth, a role that should have elevated her as a symbol of harmony. Instead, mythology cast her as something far more complicated, the eternal avenger, her life a centuries, long struggle against humiliation. Hera had not chosen her marriage. Zeus pursued her with the same persistence he showed all his conquests, disguising himself as a cuckoo bird to gain her sympathy before revealing his true form. Once she relented, their union was celebrated with divine fanfare, meant to be the ultimate model of sacred marriage. But in truth, the marriage was Olympus's longest-running tragedy. Even the gods whispered about it. Her husband strayed constantly, leaving Hera to play the role of the scorned partner, but one armed with divine fury. And Hera's fury was legendary. She rarely turned it on. Zeus himself attacking him would only destabilize Olympus further, but she aimed her wrath at his lovers and their children. Io, once a priestess, was transformed into a cow and driven to wander the earth, tormented by a stinging gadfly. Echo, the nymph cursed to repeat only the last words spoken to her, suffered isolation and heartbreak because she once distracted Hera while Zeus dallied. Semele, mother of Dionysus, was tricked by Hera into demanding Zeus reveal his true form, which incinerated her instantly. Even Heracles, Zeus's own son, felt her vengeance. As an infant, he fought off the serpents she sent to kill him in his cradle. His entire life was defined by her interference, each of his labours twisted with difficulty because Hera demanded he suffer for his father's sins. To modern ears, it sounds cruel, vindictive, unjust, punishing innocence for Zeus's choices. And yet, in Greek storytelling, Hera's vengeance wasn't just spite, it was theatre, a divine response to a cosmic insult. Imagine being the goddess of marriage, presiding over the vows and fidelity of mortals, while your husband undermines everything you represent. The myths reflect a paradox. Hera is dignity embodied in a system designed to humiliate her. Ancient Greeks were keenly aware of this irony. Marriage in their world was rarely about love. It was about alliances, dowries, heirs. Fidelity was demanded of wives, but rarely of husbands. Hera, in many ways, was the divine projection of every woman expected to preserve dignity in a marriage where power tilted away from her. When she punished Zeus's partners, mortals saw the rage of their own unacknowledged frustrations. Her cruelty was a mirror of a system already cruel to women. But Hera wasn't only a jealous wife. Her cults across Greece reveal another side, powerful, dignified, and deeply revered. In Argos, one of her greatest centers of worship, her sanctuary was larger than Zeus's own. Here, she was celebrated not for vengeance but for her authority over fertility, childbirth, and community order. The festival of the Heraia, held in her honor, included athletic contests for women, a rarity in the Greek world. In Samos, another of her holy sites, her temple was so vast that later architects said it rivaled the wonders of the world. To her devotees, Hera was not a petty goddess, but the guarantor of family, the embodiment of stability. Still, her myths almost always circle back to pain. Consider the tale of Lamia, a Libyan queen loved by Zeus. Hera cursed her to lose her children, driving her mad with grief until she became a monster who devoured others' children. Or take Callisto, a nymph who bore Zeus a son. Hera turned her into a bear, condemning her to wander until she was placed in the stars as Ursa Major. These stories paint Hera as merciless, yet they also whisper of desperation of a goddess fighting for dignity in a world where even her divine status could not shield her from betrayal. Her marriage was more than personal torment. It was a metaphor. Zeus and Hera's union symbolized the constant tug-of-war between male power and female resistance in Greek culture. In weddings, oaths were sworn in her name, as though invoking her blessing could ensure fidelity. But in myths, her own marriage was chaos, as if to remind mortals that even the gods struggled with what they demanded of humans. She was the goddess to whom brides prayed, but also the warning carved into every ceremony. Fidelity was fragile, and pain was inevitable. Art often reflects this paradox. Vase paintings show Hera enthroned beside Zeus, regal and serene, a queen in full authority. But in plays and poetry, she seethes, plots, and punishes. Aeschylus's tragedies paint her as the jealous manipulator behind divine schemes. Homer's Iliad shows her plotting against Zeus himself, seducing him with Aphrodite's magic belt to distract him during battle. She never had the raw thunder of her husband, but she had cunning, endurance, and the ability to weaponize humiliation into power. Hera's role extended beyond jealousy into cosmic justice. She punished mortals who broke oaths or disrupted sacred bonds, reminding humanity that family ties were not to be mocked. In this sense, she wasn't only a scorned wife, she was the enforcer of a value the Greeks held sacred. She reminded mortals that marriage was not a game, that loyalty and honesty were divine obligations. To betray them was to call down her wrath, whether you were a god or a farmer in a dusty village. And yet, she remained sympathetic, even fascinating. Her story wasn't just rage, it was resilience, a goddess trapped in a humiliating cycle. She carved her power out of spite and sacred vengeance. She endured centuries of betrayal, but never disappeared, never diminished. She stood beside Zeus in art and ritual, her temples filled with worshippers. If he was storm, she was stone unyielding, enduring, sharp. The Greeks did not soften her, because they understood her. Life was unfair, men strayed, promises broke. Hera was not an idealized vision of harmony, but the raw embodiment of what marriage so often became. Duty laced with bitterness, loyalty tested by betrayal, power balanced on a knife's edge. To pray to her was to ask for stability, but also to acknowledge that marriage was a battlefield where dignity was hard won. And so, Hera's paradox lived at the heart of Olympus. She was the goddess of sacred union trapped in a profane one, the goddess of family, forced to watch hers unravel daily, the queen of heaven, whose crown was forged from humiliation and whose throne stood on fury. Yet she never yielded her place, never gave up her authority, never allowed Zeus's betrayals to erase her. Instead, she turned pain into power, vengeance into identity. On Olympus, she was not loved, not even always respected, but she was feared. And in fear, there is power. Hera ruled not with lightning but with endurance, not with seduction but with vengeance. She was the embodiment of female dignity in a world that denied it, a reminder that queens survive even when their marriages fall apart. Her temples still stand in ruins across Greece, columns rising into open sky, their stones once painted in vivid colours, filled with offerings from women who prayed for safe childbirth, from brides who begged for fidelity, from men who sought forgiveness for broken oaths. Hera's worship outlasted the myths, outlasted the plays, even outlasted Zeus's thunder. The storm passes, but stone remains, and Hera was always stone. Poseidon, lord of the sea and the storm within. If Zeus ruled the sky with thunder, Poseidon claimed everything below the restless waters, the deep ocean trenches, the trembling earth itself. He was one of the three brothers who divided the cosmos after overthrowing Cronus. Zeus took the heavens, Hades the underworld, and Poseidon accepted the sea, a domain vast enough to drown empires. But unlike his brothers, Poseidon's kingdom was never still. His was a realm of constant motion, of tides that swelled and receded like moods, of storms that could annihilate fleets, and of calm waves that carried traders safely across the Aegean. He was revered, but always with caution. To the Greeks, Poseidon was not a god of abstract majesty. He was immediate, practical, and terrifying. For a people whose world revolved around the sea, he was inescapable. Sailors poured libations into the waves before voyages, whispering prayers for safe winds. Fishermen offered sacrifices of fish or goats, begging for abundant catches. Even city builders sought his approval before placing foundations too near a shore, for everyone knew Poseidon's trident could reduce stone walls to rubble in a single blow. That trident, more than a weapon, was a cosmic symbol, a three-pronged spear capable of summoning waves, splitting the ground, or stirring storms. Poets describe him striking the earth so violently that mountains quaked and entire cities collapsed. Earthquakes were his rage-given form, and the Greeks even called him Enosikthon, earth-shaker. When the ground trembled beneath their feet, they knew Poseidon was near. But his power was unpredictable, and so was he. Myths portray him as both generous and devastating. He could create new islands with a thrust of his trident, raising land from the sea as a gift. He fathered magnificent creatures, from winged Pegasus to sea monsters that tested the courage of heroes. He also unleashed floods, storms, and destruction when mortals failed to honor him properly. The pattern is clear. Poseidon demanded respect, and forgetting him was dangerous. One of his most famous outbursts came from a contest over Athens. Poseidon and Athena both desired the city. To win its devotion, each god offered a gift. Poseidon struck the Acropolis rock with his trident, creating a saltwater spring or, in some versions, a war horse. Athena offered an olive tree. Practicality won. The Athenians chose olives, oil, food, and wood over waves and horses. Poseidon's fury was immediate. He flooded the plain of Attica in retaliation. From then on, he and Athena carried an eternal rivalry, their feud echoing in myths and cults for centuries. It's worth noting that the Greeks didn't dismiss Poseidon as merely tempestuous. They understood the sea itself was a paradox, life-giving and merciless. The olive tree could be cultivated, steady, reliable. The sea, by contrast, could not be tamed. A voyage could bring wealth and adventure or ruin. In that sense, Poseidon was the god of chance, of the risks mortals had to take to grow and expand their world. His storms destroyed, yes, But his waters also carried Greek ships to new shores, spreading their culture across the Mediterranean. To live in Greece was to live with Poseidon's moods. Like his brother Zeus, Poseidon was not known for restraint in his affections. His lovers included sea nymphs, mortals, and even the tragic Medusa. In some versions of the myth, he violated her within Athena's temple, sparking Athena's wrath not at him, but at Medusa. This injustice reveals how often Poseidon escaped blame, his actions reshaping lives while he strode away untouched. His children were equally unpredictable. Theseus, the heroic king of Athens; Triton, the merman herald; Polyphemus, the monstrous Cyclops blinded by Odysseus. His offspring could be noble or monstrous, but they always carried something of his volatility. Poseidon's mythic grudges are legendary. When Odysseus blinded Polyphemus, Poseidon cursed him to wander the seas for a decade, delaying his return to Ithaca. This was not a casual annoyance, it was divine punishment with layers of suffering, meant to grind Odysseus down with longing and despair. For the Greeks, the story reinforced a lesson: never offend Poseidon. His vengeance was not swift but relentless, stretching across years, woven into the very waves that carried sailors home. Yet there are glimpses of a gentler Poseidon. In myths, he sometimes aided mortals, guiding ships or calming storms when prayers were offered sincerely. He was associated with fertility, not just of the sea but of the land, since water brought life to crops. His horses, strange though the connection seems, were symbols of this vitality. Galloping like waves across plains, they embodied his energy. Chariots drawn by seahorses appear in art, linking the two worlds, land and water, speed and swell. Temples to Poseidon were scattered along coastlines, placed on cliffs where sea and sky met. The most famous still stands, the Temple of Poseidon at Cape Saunion, perched above the Aegean. Sailors returning from long journeys could see its columns shining in the sun, a reminder that their lives depended on his will. Offerings there included bronze figurines, helmets, even entire ships, tokens of gratitude or desperate pleas for mercy. Standing among those columns today, with the wind off the sea and the horizon endless, one can feel the fear and awe the ancients must have felt. Poseidon's role extended into politics as well. In some cities, oaths were sworn by his name, especially in matters concerning seafaring trade. Colonists who set sail to found new cities often prayed first to Poseidon, asking him to carry them to fertile land. Even military expeditions relied on him. A fleet without his blessing was an invitation to disaster. To neglect him was to risk not only storms but social collapse. And so Poseidon lived in the Greek imagination as both benefactor and destroyer. He was the uncle who might gift you an island or drown your village. He could create order, calm seas, safe journeys, but also chaos, shipwrecks, floods, trembling earth. His unpredictability was his essence. But there is one more truth about Poseidon. He represented the limits of human control. The Greeks were a seafaring people, but they never pretended they mastered the ocean. Every voyage was an act of faith, every return a reminder of his power. Poseidon was not the god of safety, he was the god of risk, the divine embodiment of everything humanity cannot tame. In the myths, when Zeus thunders, mortals tremble, but when Poseidon shakes the earth, they run. His power was closer, more physical, more immediate. He was not distant in the sky, but beneath their very feet and under every wave. He was, in a sense, the god they lived with every day, the one who reminded them that survival depended not only on strength but on humility before forces too vast to master. Poseidon's legacy, then, is not only that of storm and sea but of respect. The Greeks knew they could never escape him, so they sought to live with him, to placate his fury, to invite his favour. His myths are warnings, but they are also confessions, confessions of fear, of awe, of humanity's eternal struggle against the restless powers of nature. And perhaps that is why his trident still echoes in our imagination today. It was never just a spear. It was the shape of inevitability, the storm, the quake, the wave, all reminding mortals how fragile their world truly was. Hades, the quiet king of shadows. If Poseidon's realm was restless and roaring, Hades was silent and final. He did not command the sky or sea, did not wield thunderbolts or summon waves. His dominion was hidden beneath the earth, the underworld, the inevitable home of every soul. Unlike his brothers, Hades did not rule over storms or seasons that mortals experienced daily. His power was subtler but absolute. He was the god no one could avoid, the shadow at the end of every road. And yet, contrary to modern imagination, Hades was not evil. The Greeks did not see him as their version of the devil. He was stern, yes, grim certainly, but necessary. Where Zeus embodied chaos and Poseidon unpredictability, Hades stood for order and permanence. Souls entered his realm and did not return, save for rare mythological exceptions. His task was not to torment, but to keep balance, to ensure that death remained where it belonged. In a world full of meddling, scheming gods, Hades was, ironically, the most reliable. The underworld itself bore his name, Hades. It was not a monolithic pit of suffering, but a structured realm. Within it were regions reflecting the deeds of life. The asphodel meadows held the ordinary souls, those who had lived neither heroically nor wickedly. Tartarus was deeper, a place of torment where titans and oath-breakers suffered eternal punishments. Tantalus starving with food forever out of reach, Sisyphus rolling his boulder endlessly up the hill. And then there was Elysium, a paradise of endless spring reserved for heroes and the virtuous fields where warriors feasted and poets recited verse beneath golden light. Hades presided over all of it, not as a sadistic jailer, but as a ruler managing an eternal bureaucracy. He was a cosmic administrator, ensuring souls went where they belonged, that oaths of burial were honored, that no one cheated the natural cycle. For this reason, the Greeks rarely worshipped him openly. Few temples were dedicated to him. To draw his attention was to risk it, and no one wanted death too curious about them. Yet they respected him profoundly. When they swore great oaths, they invoked his name, because nothing was more binding than the inevitability of death. Of course, his most famous story centers on Persephone, daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Hades, perhaps lonely in his dark kingdom, fell in love, or at least claimed desire for her. One day, as she gathered flowers in a meadow, the ground opened and he emerged in a chariot drawn by black horses, seizing her and carrying her below. To modern sensibilities, it is an abduction, a violation of her freedom. To the Greeks, it was also mythic logic. The blooming maiden must descend into death, for life and death are intertwined. Demeter's grief at her daughter's disappearance was catastrophic. She wandered the earth, refusing to let crops grow until Persephone was returned. Mortals starved, and the gods, deprived of offerings, demanded a solution. Zeus intervened, brokering a compromise. Persephone would spend part of the year with Hades and part with her mother. But because she had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds in the underworld, she was bound to return. Thus the seasons were born, spring and summer when she rose, autumn and winter when she descended again. The Greeks saw in this myth the explanation for fertility's cycle, but also a deeper truth. No joy is permanent, no grief eternal. Life returns, but death is always waiting. Persephone herself grew into a paradoxical queen, not simply a stolen girl, but a ruler who walked gracefully between life and death. With her at his side, Hades' realm became not only a prison, but a kingdom with balance. She softened him, or perhaps revealed the dignity beneath his sternness. Cerberus, his 3-headed hound, guarded the gates. Not even the dead could leave without permission. Heroes who descended Orpheus for his beloved Eurydice, Heracles for his labours, Odysseus seeking prophecy, all had to face Cerberus, a living boundary between worlds. Yet even here, Hades was not cruel. He allowed bargains. Orpheus nearly succeeded in reclaiming his wife. Heracles wrestled Cerberus, but returned him unharmed. Hades respected strength and cunning, though he never bent the rules entirely. Unlike Zeus and Poseidon, Hades did not seduce endlessly or wage petty rivalries. He rarely left his kingdom. He did not chase mortal lovers or meddle in wars. This distance made him seem cold, but also less hypocritical than his siblings. He represented inevitability, not indulgence. The Greeks recognized this. They built few temples, but sometimes offered black animals in sacrifice, their blood poured into the earth as libation. To honor Hades was to honor the cycle no one escaped. Still, mortals feared him. His very name was avoided in casual speech, replaced with euphemisms like Pluton, the wealthy one. For all riches of the earth, gold, silver, fertile soil came from below. To call him wealthy was to soften his image, to suggest that the underworld also gave gifts. Farmers relied on what the ground yielded. Miners sought precious metals in its depths. In this sense, Hades was not only lord of the dead but patron of abundance hidden beneath the earth. Mythmakers sometimes gave him rare moments of humanity. In some versions, he is described as treating Persephone with surprising respect once she becomes his queen, sharing his throne with her as an equal. In others, he shows restraint, never straying to other lovers, unlike Zeus. For all his darkness, he is painted as strangely loyal. He may have stolen Persephone, but he kept her, honored her, and with her, ruled not with caprice but with somber constancy. His invisibility helmet, crafted by the Cyclopes, symbolized his nature. With it, he could vanish, unseen even by gods. Heroes borrowed it, such as Perseus on his quest for Medusa. That helmet reflected Hades' role, present but hidden, powerful but quiet, shaping fate without demanding worship. Artists depicted him less often than his brothers. When he does appear, he is bearded, solemn, seated beside Persephone, a staff in hand, the ruler of shadows but not of cruelty. His image was not meant to terrify but to remind. Death is not to be mocked. In plays, his presence is implied more than shown. His authority is everywhere, but his voice rarely heard. In truth, the Greeks needed Hades as much as they feared him. Without him, the cosmos lacked balance. Life cannot flourish without death, fertility without decay, joy without mourning. His kingdom was not punishment, but preservation. He kept the cycle intact, guarded boundaries no one else could. His silence, in a world of noisy gods, was its own kind of strength. So while Zeus thundered and Poseidon raged, Hades waited, patient, unmoved. He did not demand prayers daily, nor festivals in his honor. He simply kept watch at the end of every life, ensuring order where chaos might otherwise reign. He was, in many ways, the most inevitable of the gods, less dramatic, but more certain. The Greeks did not love him, but they respected him deeply. They left offerings at graves, coins for Charon the ferryman, cakes for Cerberus. They buried their dead with rites not only for the soul's sake, but to appease Hades, so that the deceased would cross peacefully into his realm. Their greatest fear was not death itself, but dishonor, wandering unburied and restless. To die without rites was to offend Hades, to deny him his due. That dread says everything about his authority. He did not need to chase mortals. Mortals came to him. Hades, the quiet brother, the uncelebrated king, stood as the final equalizer. All souls, king and peasant, hero and coward, entered his halls. No thunderbolt could protect you. No sacrifice could bribe him for escape. His strength was not in noise, but in permanence. If Zeus represented the chaos of power, Poseidon the risk of nature, then Hades was inevitability itself. And perhaps that is why he was feared most of all, not because he was cruel, but because he was fair. Athena, wisdom, strategy, and the spider's web. If Hades embodied silence, Athena embodied clarity, sharp as a drawn blade, calm as a still pool that hides endless depth. She was the goddess of wisdom, war strategy, and crafts. And unlike so many of her fellow Olympians, she seemed to thrive not on chaos but on control. Where Ares brought the blind fury of battle, Athena carried the intelligence of a commander, the patience of a weaver, and the dignity of a goddess who did not need romance, jealousy, or spectacle to assert her power. Her birth alone set her apart. Zeus, fearing prophecy, swallowed her mother Metis, the goddess of cunning intelligence, while she was pregnant. To prevent being overthrown by a child cleverer than himself, he sought to absorb the threat. But fate is never so easily outwitted. Zeus soon developed a searing headache, a pain so unbearable that he begged Hephaestus to split his skull with a hammer. From the wound, Athena sprang forth fully grown, armoured, and already radiant with power. The Greeks imagined her emerging with a war cry that echoed across heaven, though others said she simply stepped calmly into the light, her spear gleaming, her shield unshaken. Either way, she was different, born not of weakness or desire, but of thought itself. Athena's intelligence shaped everything about her. She was not war for war's sake that belonged to Ares. She was war as discipline, as planning, as the slow chess game of strategy. In Homer's Iliad, she advises warriors with patience, guiding Odysseus with clever tactics, restraining Achilles' fury when blood threatened to overwhelm reason. She was the goddess of the war council, not the battlefield brawl. To her, victory was not about who struck hardest, but who thought longest. Yet her wisdom stretched beyond warfare. She was patron of crafts, especially weaving. At first, weaving may seem trivial beside the clash of spears, but to the Greeks it was a discipline that mirrored the art of strategy. To weave was to plan, to thread each strand deliberately, to create order from chaos. For Athena, the loom was as much a battlefield as the plain of Troy. She was the goddess of those who shaped civilization not only with swords but with hands, craftsmen, builders, artisans. Her city, Athens, bore her name, chosen because she offered the olive tree, symbol of peace, nourishment, and prosperity, instead of Poseidon's violent saltwater spring. The Athenians chose olives over the ocean, wisdom over rage, stability over unpredictability. Their empire rose in her name. Athena was famously unentangled in romance. She did not marry, did not seduce, did not bear children. She stood outside the endless soap opera of Olympus's tangled affairs. This independence made her unique, a goddess who defined herself not by her relationships but by her intellect and actions. In myths, mortals who forgot this boundary often paid dearly. The tale of Arachne is perhaps the clearest example. Arachne, a mortal weaver, grew proud of her skill and dared to challenge Athena in a contest. Her tapestry was flawless, some say even superior, depicting the scandals and hypocrisies of the gods. Athena, enraged at her defiance, tore the work apart. Overcome with shame, Arachne tried to hang herself, but Athena transformed her into a spider, condemning her to weave forever. It was both punishment and strange mercy, a reminder that hubris before the gods had consequences, but also that talent, even punished, was immortalized. To the Greeks, it was a lesson: do not mock the divine, no matter how great your gifts. Her wisdom extended to heroes as well. Perseus, tasked with slaying Medusa, succeeded only because Athena lent him her polished shield, which allowed him to see without being petrified. Odysseus survived Troy and the trials of his long journey home because she whispered in his ear, guiding him through storms and stratagems. Even Heracles, though cursed by her stepmother Hera, found counsel in Athena at crucial moments. Unlike Zeus, who often abandoned his children, Athena intervened with calm, steady guidance. Heroes sought her not for raw strength, but for the clarity she provided when chaos raged. Her image was iconic, helmeted, spear in hand, shield upon her arm, often accompanied by an owl, the bird of watchfulness and night vision. The owl was not chosen at random. It symbolized the ability to see clearly in darkness, to perceive truths others missed. In statues, Athena stood tall, often armored, yet her face serene. She was not frantic like Ares, not sensual like Aphrodite. She was composed, embodying the strength of restraint. Athena also carried the aegis, a shield or breastplate often adorned with the head of Medusa. This was no mere ornament. To carry Medusa's gaze was to wield terror itself, to turn enemies to stone with a glance. It is an unsettling image. The goddess of wisdom wearing the symbol of a woman punished unjustly. Some later writers whispered that Athena did this not out of cruelty but to preserve Medusa's power, transforming tragedy into a weapon. Regardless of interpretation, the aegis was a reminder that wisdom does not exclude ferocity. Athena was protector, yes, but never harmless. Her influence was civic as well as personal. In Athens, she was the heart of the polis. The Parthenon, her temple on the Acropolis, stood as a beacon of art and devotion. Within it, a colossal statue by Phidias depicted her in gold and ivory, towering above mortals, embodying both the beauty of craft and the might of divinity. Festivals like the Panathenea honoured her with processions, sacrifices, and contests, weaving together civic pride and religious devotion. To worship Athena was to celebrate not only divinity but the very identity of Athens, wisdom, courage, and innovation. But Athena was not gentle in all things. She could be merciless to those who broke boundaries. Teiresias, the mortal who stumbled upon her bathing, was struck blind instantly, not out of pettiness, but to preserve her sacred dignity. Yet she balanced punishment with recompense, granting him the gift of prophecy in exchange for sight. Here, as always, Athena combined severity with fairness. In myth, she often clashed with Ares. Where he stormed into battle roaring, she calculated. Where he drenched the earth in blood, she sought to end war quickly. Homer shows her intervening in duels, mocking Ares as foolish, reckless, the embodiment of chaos. The Greeks themselves admired her far more. Warriors prayed to Ares for strength, but to Athena for victory. In the end, brains triumphed over brawn. Her wisdom, however, was not merely intellectual, it was deeply moral. Athena often acted as arbiter in disputes. In the Orestia, Aeschylus's great trilogy, she presides over the first trial by jury, introducing law as a way to end cycles of blood vengeance. This was revolutionary, the goddess of wisdom offering humanity a system of justice, replacing endless feuds with structured resolution. It reflected Athens' own ideals of democracy and civic order, projecting them onto their patron goddess. Athena's paradox is that she was both nurturing and merciless, peaceful and warlike. She defended cities, encouraged invention, guided heroes but punished arrogance, crushed defiance, and maintained boundaries with steel. She was not sentimental. She was clarity given form, a goddess who reminded mortals that reason must prevail over impulse, that civilization was built not only by strength but by restraint. In a pantheon overflowing with chaos, Zeus's appetites, Hera's vengeance, Poseidon's storms, Ares' rage, Athena stood apart. She was not flawless, but she was consistent. She embodied the Greeks' highest aspirations, wisdom guiding power, intelligence shaping survival. If you were a craftsman at your loom, a general at your maps, a poet at your verses, Athena was the presence at your shoulder. She whispered not passion or fury, but precision. And for the Greeks, that was divinity enough. Ares, the fury of battle. If Athena was war-shaped by thought, Ares was war stripped bare of everything but blood and chaos. Where she represented strategy, discipline, and civic defense, Ares embodied the raw scream of the battlefield, the moment when reason collapses and men clash in madness. To the Greeks, he was not a hero but a necessary terror, the god of carnage whose presence turned order into slaughter. His lineage was fitting. Son of Zeus and Hera, born from a union already steeped in conflict. The Greeks did not adore him as they did Athena. In fact, they often feared and despised him. Homer calls him hateful to Zeus, and even his father mocked him as reckless, destructive, a god who cared nothing for justice. And yet his presence was undeniable. No war erupted without him. No field of corpses lacked his shadow. He was the fire in men's eyes, the panic that spread when the first spear struck. Ares had no patience for plans or negotiations. He was impulse incarnate, rushing into battle with chariot and spear. His sons Phobos, fear, and Deimos, terror, galloping beside him, spreading dread before armies. His daughter Enyo, goddess of war's destruction, often joined him, her joy found in ruin. Wherever they rode, blood soaked the ground. To mortals, this was not inspiration, but contagion. Ares infected men with frenzy, with the lust to kill even when reason screamed to flee. Unlike Athena, Ares did not stand for causes. He fought not for justice, not for cities, but for the chaos of combat itself. In myth, he sided with both Greeks and Trojans at different moments in the Iliad, not out of loyalty, but because battle itself called to him. Even when wounded, struck down by Athena's cunning, or pierced by Diomedes with divine aid, he sulked. Not because he cared for victory, but because his pride was hurt. His wounds revealed something telling. Despite his violence, he was vulnerable, mortal, like in his capacity to suffer. The Greeks used this to emphasize a cultural truth. Brute force without discipline falters, no matter how loud its roar. Still, Ares was terrifying. The clang of his armor, the neighing of his horses, the shrieks of his companions, all were omens of slaughter. Soldiers feared invoking him, lest his frenzy consume them. Yet in desperation they prayed to him for courage, hoping he would spare them his wrath or lend them strength. He was the god of the moment when knees buckled and hearts raced, when survival demanded fury. In that sense, Ares was not loved, but acknowledged. No one could deny the reality of panic, of rage, of war's dehumanizing pull. The Greeks themselves had an uneasy relationship with Ares. Unlike Athena, who had temples across the land, Ares was worshipped sparsely. His cult was strongest in Thrace, a region the Greeks considered wild and barbarous, filled with tribes they associated with unbridled violence. To the Athenians, who prized reason, democracy, and strategy, Ares felt foreign, a reminder of war's ugliest face. Yet even in Athens his name was etched into law. The Areopagus, the Hill of Ares, served as the city's high court, a place where murder trials were judged. Here, violence and justice met, reminding Athenians that even war's fury had to be answered by order. Ares' love life only deepened his notoriety. He was famously entangled with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, though she was married to Hephaestus. Their affair was passionate but reckless, and when Hephaestus discovered them, he crafted an invisible net that caught the lovers in the act. He summoned the other gods to witness their humiliation, and Ares endured the laughter of Olympus. For a god of war, there was nothing more wounding than ridicule. Even here, myth painted him as less respected than his peers. Yet Ares was not entirely without honor. In some traditions, he defended his daughter Alcippe from assault, killing her attacker and facing judgment before the other gods. It was for this act that the Areopagus gained its name. The myth suggested that even within carnage, Ares retained a trace of loyalty, a flicker of justice. Still, such moments were rare. More often, he was the brawler no one wanted at the feast, the guest who turned arguments into duels and duels into bloodbaths. In Roman tradition, Ares was reborn as Mars, and here the story shifts. The Romans, unlike the Greeks, revered him as a father of their people, the sire of Romulus and Remus. They elevated him into a god of disciplined military power, civic order, and conquest. The Romans needed a god who glorified war, not mocked it, and so Ares was rehabilitated. But the Greeks, who knew the fragility of their city-states and the devastation of endless wars, kept him as a figure of fear and distaste. To them, Athena was the defender of civilization. Ares was the fire that could consume it. In art, Ares was often depicted as youthful, strong, armored, his face handsome but hard. Yet unlike Athena, he lacked serenity. His features glowed with intensity, his body coiled for violence. To look at Ares was to see the soldier who charges without command, the warrior who lives for the clash. not the cause. The Greeks also associated him with wild animals, boars, dogs, vultures, symbols of brutality and scavenging. These were not noble creatures, but reminders of war's ugliness. The scavenger feeding on the fallen, the beast charging blindly into spears. Ares was not idealized. He was the embodiment of war as corruption, as bloodlust, as frenzy that devours both sides. And yet, for all their disdain, the Greeks admitted a truth. Sometimes survival requires Ares. Strategy, discipline, wisdom all collapse in the face of sheer terror. In that moment, when men must scream louder than their fear, Ares's fury becomes necessary. Warriors offered him sacrifices before battle, not because they admired him, but because they needed him. He was the shadow no one wished to embrace, yet the shadow that fell across every battlefield. In myth, his defeats reinforced his role. Athena bested him repeatedly, not with strength, but with cunning. The lesson was clear. Intelligence rules war, not brute force. But Ares returned each time, battered yet unbroken, because violence cannot be eradicated. It waits, it seethes, it rises again with each conflict. The Greeks may have scorned him, but they never denied him. Ares was the unwanted truth they carried into every campaign. War is not noble, it is slaughter. So Ares thundered across the fields of myth, a god both hated and necessary. He was the sound of panic in the dark, the clash of swords without reason, the scream before the end. The Greeks prayed he would pass them by, but they knew he never truly did. Aphrodite, desire and disaster. If Ares was chaos on the battlefield, Aphrodite was chaos in the heart. She was the goddess of love, beauty, and desire, yet her influence was rarely tender. To the Greeks, love was not only sweetness, it was madness, the kind of passion that topples kings and burns cities. And no one embodied that more than Aphrodite, who could enchant gods and mortals alike, unraveling reason with a single glance. Her origins are themselves divided, as if even the poets could not agree on how to explain her power. One version calls her the daughter of Zeus and the goddess Dione, born conventionally. The older and more infamous tale says otherwise, that she rose from the sea foam created when Cronus hurled Uranus's severed genitals into the ocean. From violence came beauty, from dismemberment came desire. It is one of mythology's cruel ironies, the goddess of love born from an act of cosmic mutilation. And yet, the Greeks did not find the contradiction troubling. They understood love's dual nature, gentle, yes, but also destructive, often forged in pain. When Aphrodite appeared, the world itself changed. Flowers bloomed where her feet touched. Birds circled in joyful flocks. Seas calmed, breezes sweetened. Her beauty was not just physical, but cosmic, an ordering force that bent the universe toward attraction. Mortals who saw her became obsessed, their will eroded. Gods who encountered her found their pride diminished. Desire, the Greeks believed, was stronger than reason, and Aphrodite was its divine embodiment. Yet for all her power, she was not spared indignity. Zeus, wary of her influence, married her to Hephaestus, the lame and hard-working god of fire and craftsmanship. It was not a marriage of passion, but of containment, binding beauty to toil, desire to restraint. But Aphrodite was never restrained. She despised the match, and her heart, or rather, her appetite, belonged elsewhere. Most famously, she pursued Ares. Their affair was legendary, both for its passion and its humiliation. When Hephaestus discovered them, he ensnared the lovers in an invisible net, capturing them mid-embrace and summoning the other gods to witness their shame. The scene became a divine comedy, with Olympus laughing at the trapped pair. Yet for all the ridicule, Aphrodite's reputation never diminished. She remained irresistible. Desire, after all, does not vanish when mocked. It persists, burns and spreads, often more dangerous when denied. Aphrodite's powers were not confined to Olympus. Among mortals, her touch was transformative and devastating. She carried a magical girdle, the cestus, which made anyone who wore it utterly desirable. Even Hera once borrowed it to beguile Zeus. To invoke Aphrodite was to call upon irresistible charm, a weapon subtler than any spear but no less potent. Lovers prayed to her before confessions, brides before weddings, even generals before negotiations. For desire was not only for romance, it was persuasion, diplomacy, manipulation. She was patron not just of passion but of power wielded through allure. Yet her myths rarely show happy endings. Consider Phaedra, struck by desire for her stepson through Aphrodite's influence, leading to tragedy and death, or Hippolytus, who refused to honor Aphrodite and instead worshipped Artemis. In revenge, Aphrodite cursed him with ruin, or the most famous tale of all, the Judgment of Paris, when Eris, goddess of strife, threw a golden apple marked to the fairest among the goddesses. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite each claimed it. To settle the dispute, Paris, prince of Troy, was chosen as judge. Each goddess offered a bribe. Hera promised kingship, Athena promised wisdom and victory, and Aphrodite promised the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose beauty, chose Aphrodite, and so received Helen of Sparta. But Helen was already married. Her abduction or seduction sparked the Trojan War, a conflict that consumed generations. All for desire, all for beauty, all for Aphrodite's gift. This was the darker side of her divinity. Love was not gentle but destabilizing. Entire civilizations could burn because one man or woman succumbed to passion. The Greeks knew this well, and they wove it into Aphrodite's myth. She was not just the goddess of kisses and embraces, but of consequences, of wars born from infatuation. Her temples were full of prayers not only for love but for protection from it. Still, she had a softer side. She often aided young lovers, guiding them through trials. She comforted Psyche when she became immortal, reconciling with her despite earlier jealousies. She blessed unions, sanctified intimacy, and, in her Roman form as Venus, became the divine mother of Aeneas, and thus of Rome itself. Love could be destructive, but it was also creative. Without Aphrodite, there was no continuity of life, no allure of companionship, no poetry in the human condition. Her cults reflected this duality. In Cyprus, her birthplace, according to myth, she was worshipped with great devotion. Festivals celebrated her with processions, offerings, and even sacred prostitution in some traditions, where sexuality itself was seen as divine. In Corinth, her temple housed priestesses who embodied her presence, serving both spiritual and physical roles. To worship Aphrodite was to accept that desire was not shameful but sacred, though dangerous. The Greeks did not sanitize love. They placed it on an altar, acknowledging its power to elevate and destroy. Aphrodite's symbols reveal her character: doves, sparrows, swans, creatures of grace, but also of mating frenzy. The myrtle tree, fragrant and evergreen, sacred to her. The seashell, recalling her birth, delicate yet sheltering. Artists depicted her nude more often than any other goddess, not as objectification alone, but as a statement. Beauty itself was divine. Statues like Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnidos stunned viewers, not merely with physical form, but with the sense that the goddess's presence radiated through every curve. She was not simply seen, she was felt. Philosophers, too, wrestled with her meaning. Plato distinguished between two Aphrodites: Aphrodite Pandemos, goddess of common love, tied to physical desire, and Aphrodite Urania, goddess of higher love, the soul's yearning for truth and beauty. This duality captured her essence. She was at once sensual and transcendent, pulling mortals toward passion but also toward ideals. Her paradox made her both beloved and feared. She could bless marriages or tear them apart, bring joy or devastation. Where Hera represented marriage as duty and dignity, Aphrodite represented the dangerous allure of passion that ignored rules. In many ways, they were opposites. Hera demanded fidelity, Aphrodite tempted betrayal. Yet together they reflected the full spectrum of human love, order and chaos, law and longing. In myths, Aphrodite often reveals how fragile mortals are before emotion. Heroes who could face monsters fell helpless before her charms. Kings who ruled cities toppled at the sight of a beautiful face. She reminded the Greeks of something they could not control, the human heart, and in that reminder lay her divinity. Ares had his fire-breathing horses, Athena her owl, Zeus his lightning. Aphrodite needed none of these. She needed only a smile, a glance, the brush of her presence. Wars began, lives ended, temples rose, all for the desire she embodied. She was proof that the most powerful force in the cosmos was not thunder or storm, but longing. And perhaps that was why the Greeks never diminished her, no matter how dangerous her myths. They knew that love was irresistible, that beauty was both blessing and curse. Aphrodite was not a goddess of stability, but of disruption, the flame that melts reason, the tide that sweeps away foundations. She was, in every sense, both desire and disaster, Hephaestus, the forge of the gods. While Aphrodite stirred chaos with desire, Hephaestus built order with fire and iron. He was the god of metalwork, craftsmanship, and invention, the only Olympian who laboured like a mortal. Where others revelled in power or passion, he hammered, melted and forged, shaping the weapons and palaces of the divine. His presence was not dramatic but essential, the quiet strength behind the thunderbolts, tridents and shields that filled Greek myth. His birth was unkind. In some tales, Hera bore him alone, without Zeus, out of spite, seeking to prove she needed no husband to create a god. But when Hephaestus emerged, deformed, with a lame leg, she rejected him. In rage or disgust, she hurled him from Olympus. He fell for an entire day before crashing into the sea, where Thetis and Eurynome, gentle sea goddesses, raised him in secret. In other versions, it was Zeus who cast him down after a quarrel, making him yet another child bruised by divine dysfunction. Whichever tale one believes, Hephaestus began not with glory, but with abandonment. Yet he turned exile into strength. In his underwater workshop he discovered his gift, the fire of creation. He built tools no god had imagined, crafted metals into living beauty. Eventually he returned to Olympus not by forgiveness but by leverage. He created a golden throne for Hera, gleaming and perfect, but once she sat upon it, it trapped her. The gods pleaded for him to release her. Only when Dionysus coaxed him back with wine did Hephaestus return, demanding a place among the Olympians. By cunning and craft, the outcast regained his throne. Once back in Olympus, Hephaestus never stopped working. He forged Zeus's lightning bolts, Poseidon's trident, Hermes' winged sandals, Achilles' near-invulnerable armour, and countless other wonders. His forge was the divine workshop, and his labour kept Olympus armed and adorned. Where Ares wielded brute force, Hephaestus created the tools that made force effective. Where Athena offered strategy, Hephaestus supplied the equipment. His role was invisible yet indispensable, a reflection of how Greeks valued craftsmen, not glamorous, but the foundation of civilization. But though his creations were admired, he himself was mocked. His limp set him apart in a pantheon obsessed with beauty and perfection. Even his marriage to Aphrodite was not a gift, but an irony, binding the least beautiful god to the goddess of beauty itself. The gods laughed, and Aphrodite betrayed him openly with Ares. Yet Hephaestus's revenge was clever rather than violent. When he discovered the affair, he set a trap, a delicate, invisible net of bronze chains. When the lovers met, they were caught in place, unable to move. He summoned the other gods to witness their humiliation. It was not strength but craft that avenged him. This episode revealed Hephaestus's character. He did not bellow or rage. He schemed. His anger was measured, expressed through creation rather than destruction. Even his vengeance had artistry, practical, precise, humiliating. He was not the god of brute force but of ingenuity, the mind that reshapes raw materials into something lasting. His forge symbolized more than weapons. To the Greeks, fire was civilization itself, the hearth that warmed homes, the kiln that baked pottery, the flame that tempered iron into plowshares and swords. Hephaestus was not simply divine smith, but the spirit of invention, of humanity's ability to transform nature into culture. His temples often stood near workshops, and blacksmiths prayed to him for guidance. Unlike other Olympians, he was truly relatable, scarred, rejected, working tirelessly, and yet vital to the world. His helpers, the Kurai Chrysiai, were golden automatons he crafted to serve him, a marvel of ancient imagination. These mechanical attendants walked and spoke, assisting in his forge. Through them, Hephaestus became the god of invention itself, hinting at dreams of technology far beyond the Greeks' reach. In Homer, he even crafted tripods that could move on their own early visions of robotics. He was not merely divine laborer, but visionary. Despite his deformity, he was not powerless. When angered, he hurled blazing sparks or molten metal. He once split open Zeus's skull to release Athena, proving his indispensable role in mythic order. He created jewelry of breathtaking beauty, thrones of glittering gold, palaces with shining walls. He was the craftsman of the cosmos, his forge echoing with divine necessity. Yet his life was not without bitterness. Though he built for the gods, he was rarely respected as their equal. His limp marked him as lesser in their eyes, and his toil, though essential, was taken for granted. His marriage was ridiculed, his talents overshadowed by mockery, and still he endured, pouring his pain into fire and steel. In many ways, he was the most human of the gods, flawed, labouring, unappreciated, but indispensable. The Greeks themselves understood this paradox. They valued artisans deeply, yet often treated them as lower than warriors or politicians. Hephaestus embodied that contradiction, mocked for his body, celebrated for his skill. In him, they projected both admiration for craft and discomfort with imperfection. His presence on Olympus was a reminder that civilization is not built by beauty or desire, but by work, by the hands that hammer, shape, and endure. In Rome, Hephaestus became Vulcan, worshipped as god of fire and volcanoes. His forge was imagined in the heart of Etna, the mountain trembling with his labour. The Romans emphasized his destructive side, the eruption, the blaze that consumes cities. But the Greeks kept him closer to home, the divine blacksmith whose sparks lit both the battlefield and the hearth. His myths do not glow with glory like Zeus or allure like Aphrodite. They smoulder with endurance. Hephaestus reminds us that greatness is not always loud. Sometimes it limps, sometimes it sweats in silence. Sometimes it is mocked even as it saves the world. The gods might have laughed at his crooked gait, but every time they lifted a shield, threw a spear, or watched Zeus hurl a bolt of lightning, they held Hephaestus's work in their hands. He was not glamorous, but he was irreplaceable. And in the end, perhaps that is the truest kind of power. Not the power that dazzles, but the power that endures. Hermes, the trickster on winged sandals. If Hephaestus was the labourer of Olympus, pounding metal into permanence, Hermes was its restless wanderer, swift, sly, always in motion. He was the god of travellers, commerce, boundaries, thieves, liars, and messages, a divine multitasker who slipped between worlds with ease. Where other gods thundered or schemed, Hermes laughed, darted, and bargained. He was the only one who could walk into the underworld and out again without fear, the messenger who carried Zeus's commands, and the trickster who broke rules almost as often as he enforced them. From the moment of his birth, Hermes revealed his nature. On the very day he left his mother's womb, he escaped his cradle, wandered across the hills of Arcadia, and stole Apollo's sacred cattle. To hide his crime, he reversed their hooves so they appeared to walk in the opposite direction, covering his tracks with clever deceit. Not content with theft, he then invented the lyre, crafting it from a tortoise shell, strings of sheep gut, and a spark of genius. When Apollo confronted him, Hermes played so sweetly that the god of music forgave him, accepting the lyre as a gift. Thus, in his infancy, Hermes showed the paradox that would define him: a thief who charmed his victims, a liar whose cleverness became creation. The Greeks adored this side of him. Unlike Zeus, who terrified, or Hera, who punished, Hermes felt familiar, closer to mortal cunning, the wit required to survive in a harsh world. Farmers prayed to Demeter for crops, sailors to Poseidon for calm seas, but merchants, travellers, and even gamblers turned to Hermes. He represented risk, luck, and cleverness, the small margins by which ordinary people lived or died. He was patron of markets, crossroads, and doorways, those liminal spaces where boundaries blur. As messenger of the gods, he carried Zeus's words to mortals and immortals alike, his winged sandals and cap making him faster than wind. But he was more than a divine courier. He was a guide, a psychopomp, leading souls down into Hades' realm. Mortals feared the underworld, but Hermes' presence softened the passage. He escorted the dead with surprising gentleness, proof that beneath his mischief lived a god of necessary compassion. He also served as helper of heroes, always with a grin and a trick up his sleeve. When Perseus was tasked with slaying Medusa, Hermes gave him a curved blade and guided him to the Graeae, the sisters who shared one eye. When Odysseus faced Circe, it was Hermes who supplied him with the herb moly to resist her enchantments. Unlike Athena, who advised with patience, or Hera, who manipulated with wrath, Hermes intervened with speed and subtlety. He was the god who appeared just when needed most, slipping into the story like a shadow and vanishing again just as quickly. Yet his nature was not always noble. Hermes was patron of thieves as much as of traders, and in Greek thought, the line between the two was thin. The market stall and the pickpocket's hand both relied on persuasion, speed, and audacity. Greeks acknowledged this ambiguity without shame. To them, Hermes was not immoral but amoral, a god of cleverness itself, whether used for trade or trickery. Even in law courts, his name was invoked when persuasion and rhetoric held sway. Words, after all, can be as slippery as footsteps in sand, and Hermes ruled over both. Hermes' staff, the caduceus, symbolized his nature, a rod entwined with two serpents, crowned with wings. It marked him as mediator, bringing balance between opposing forces, life and death, gods and mortals, commerce and theft. In later centuries, the caduceus was confused with the rod of Asclepius, symbol of medicine, leading to the modern association of Hermes with healing. But in Greek thought, the staff was about negotiation, boundaries, and exchange. Hermes could soothe conflicts as easily as he started them, bringing order through clever compromise. His cult was widespread. Unlike Hades, whose temples were rare, Hermes appeared everywhere. Simple stone pillars carved with his head and phallus, called herms, stood along roadsides, in marketplaces, and at city gates. They served as boundary markers and protective symbols, reminding travelers that Hermes watched over their journey. Athenians placed them throughout their city, and when one night many were vandalized, it was seen not as mischief but as political sacrilege, shaking trust in the very fabric of civic life. Hermes was not merely myth, he was woven into daily existence, a reminder that all movement, all exchange, bore divine witness. His personality, however, was not solemn but playful. In Homeric hymns, he teases Apollo, bargains with Zeus, charms mortals with jokes. He is never still, never dour. Even his worship had this lightness. Sacrifices to Hermes were modest honey, cakes, small animals' offerings reflecting speed and simplicity rather than grandeur. For a god of travellers, lavish temples mattered less than the small shrines at crossroads where a weary soul might pause, whisper a prayer, and move on. And yet, beneath the laughter, Hermes was serious. He crossed boundaries others could not. He alone could step into the underworld without Hades' wrath. He alone could converse with both gods and mortals, moving between divine law and human need. This made him indispensable, the diplomat no one trusted completely but everyone required. Zeus himself relied on him constantly, sending him on errands of delicate persuasion or covert manipulation. If Athena was the strategist of Olympus, Hermes was its fixer, ensuring schemes unfolded smoothly. The Romans, who called him Mercury, embraced this aspect even more. To them, he was patron of trade and profit, the god of wealth circulation. Statues of Mercury often stood in forums and marketplaces, blending commerce with divinity. His name gave rise to the word mercantile, reflecting his eternal connection to exchange. But the Greeks saw him with more ambiguity. Hermes was not simply patron of prosperity but of risk, the gamble that could end in gain or ruin. He was the whisper at the dice game, the shadow following the merchant's caravan, the invisible hand guiding a traveller's path. He was the god of uncertainty itself, and to a people who lived with precarious harvests, volatile seas, and fragile city-states, this uncertainty was not abstract, it was life. Hermes' myths remind us of humanity's uneasy relationship with cleverness. Cunning can save, but it can also deceive. It can build civilizations through trade, or corrupt them through lies. The Greeks knew this, and so they gave cunning a god not to moralize it, but to honor its power. Hermes was that power-given form, winged and smiling, slipping between the cracks of order. In art, he was youthful, graceful, often depicted in motion. His hat, the petasos, marked him as traveller. His sandals bore wings, always ready to fly. In contrast to Ares' armoured ferocity or Zeus's thunderous majesty, Hermes seemed light, almost delicate. Yet his lightness was deceptive, masking influence that touched every sphere of life. The truth of Hermes is that he embodied humanity's own adaptability. He was not strongest, wisest, or most beautiful, but he was quickest. He adjusted, improvised, survived. And in a world where storms destroyed fleets, wars crushed cities, and plague erased families, survival through cleverness mattered as much as strength. Hermes was the patron of that resilience, the ability to slip past disaster, to laugh in the face of ruin, to keep moving when others fell. So he darted across Olympus and earth alike, carrying words, guiding souls, tricking kings, rescuing heroes. He was never fully trusted, never entirely loved, but always necessary. For in every bargain, every journey, every choice between truth and deception, Hermes was there, grinning, watching, waiting to see whether mortals would stumble or dance. Demeter, hunger, harvest, and a mother's grief. If Hermes embodied motion, quick as thought, Demeter embodied stillness, the cycle of the earth, the slow rhythm of planting and harvest. She was the goddess of grain, fertility, and sustenance, the divine force that kept mortals alive. In a pantheon filled with thunder and passion, she was quieter, more patient, but no less powerful. For without her blessing, fields withered, fruit rotted, and famine stalked the land. To the Greeks, agriculture was civilization itself. Hunters and wanderers depended on luck, but farmers built cities, temples, and stability. Demeter's presence was in every loaf of bread, every stalk of barley, every vineyard heavy with grapes. She was not glamorous like Aphrodite or terrifying like Ares, but she was essential. Without her, no sacrifice could be offered, no festival could be held, no polis could survive. Her story, however, is defined not by abundance but by loss. She was mother to Persephone, a radiant maiden who symbolized springtime and bloom. One day, as Persephone gathered flowers in a meadow, the earth split open, and Hades rose from the underworld, seizing her in his chariot. The abduction was swift, brutal, and sanctioned by Zeus himself, who had quietly promised his daughter to his brother. The ground closed, and Persephone was gone. When Demeter discovered her child missing, grief consumed her. She wandered the earth disguised as a mortal, torch in hand, searching day and night. Her sorrow transformed into wrath. Refusing to let the earth yield its fruits, she cursed the soil into barrenness. Crops failed, animals starved, Mortals cried out in famine. The world itself seemed to grieve with her. The gods tried to intervene, but Demeter would not relent. Her love for Persephone outweighed all pleas. Even Zeus, who usually ignored mortal suffering, grew anxious as sacrifices dwindled, no grain meant no offerings, and without offerings, Olympus grew weaker. At last, he sent Hermes to negotiate Persephone's return. But the underworld does not release easily. Persephone had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds in Hades' realm, binding her to it by ancient law. A compromise was struck. She would spend part of the year with her mother and part with her husband. And so the seasons were born. When Persephone returned, Demeter rejoiced, and the earth blossomed with spring and summer. When she descended again, Demeter mourned, and autumn and winter withered the land. The Greeks saw in this myth an explanation for the cycle of fertility and decay, for the inevitable hunger of the cold months. Yet the tale is more than a seasonal metaphor. It is a story of grief, endurance, and maternal rage. Demeter was not a goddess of passive acceptance. She forced Olympus itself to yield to her will. Even Zeus, who ruled heaven with lightning, bent before the hunger she commanded. Her famine was a weapon sharper than any spear, a reminder that even kings are powerless when bread runs out. Demeter's cult reflected this gravity. She was worshipped not with frivolous festivals but with solemn rites. The most famous was the Eleusinian Mysteries, held in Eleusis near Athens. For centuries, initiates, ordinary men and women alike, participated in secret ceremonies honoring Demeter and Persephone. The exact rituals remain unknown, guarded with silence, but their promise was clear. Through Demeter's mysteries, one could glimpse hope for life after death, a blessing beyond hunger and grief. In a world shadowed by mortality, Demeter offered not just bread, but meaning. Her temples were often simple, built near fertile fields rather than towering mountains. Farmers left first fruits as offerings, trusting her to bless the harvest. Women, especially, revered her, for she presided not only over crops, but over childbirth, nurture, and the sacred bond of mother and child. Where Hera was marriage and Aphrodite passion, Demeter was sustenance, the steady presence of care. But she was also dangerous. When angered, her vengeance was not fiery but cold, the slow cruelty of starvation. In one myth, when the people of a town disrespected her, she buried their fields in blight. In another, when a king mocked her, she cursed him into madness. Mortals feared her quiet wrath, for it struck not with noise but with silence, the silence of empty granaries, the silence of barren fields. The story of Demeter and Persephone carried deep cultural resonance. It reflected not only agricultural cycles but the human experience of loss and return. Every family knew the ache of separation, the hope of reunion. Every farmer knew the dread of barren months, the joy of the first sprout. Demeter's myth transformed these realities into divine drama, making hunger and harvest part of cosmic law. Artists portrayed her with sheaves of wheat, a torch, or a cornucopia overflowing with abundance. Yet her face was rarely ecstatic. More often, it was solemn, dignified, touched by sorrow. She was beauty tinged with grief, for her motherhood was never free of loss. Philosophers, too, reflected on her. To them, Demeter's mysteries symbolized the cycle of life and death, the descent into darkness and the return to light. Plato wrote of the soul's journey as akin to Persephone's, bound to the underworld but destined for renewal. The Eleusinian mysteries carried this hope into ritual, offering initiates not knowledge but experience and encounter with the divine rhythm of loss and return. And so Demeter endured, not as a goddess of glamour but as one of necessity. Mortals prayed to Zeus for storms, to Poseidon for safe seas, but to Demeter for survival itself. Every grain of barley ground into flour, every loaf baked on a hearth, was her presence. Her grief had shaped the seasons, her love had preserved life. She was not a goddess of war, but she could bring nations to their knees. She was not a goddess of passion, but she shaped every family, every field. In her silence lay power, in her sorrow lay resilience. Demeter was not merely the goddess of harvest. She was hunger itself, its cruelty when denied, its abundance when granted, its eternal cycle of loss and renewal. Dionysus, ecstasy and madness. If Demeter was the slow rhythm of planting and harvest, Dionysus was the wild eruption after the god of wine, revelry, theatre, and ecstasy. Where Demeter embodied stillness, he embodied motion not of Hermes' swift cunning, but of intoxication, stumbling, swaying, laughing, crying, shouting, collapsing into song. He was contradiction itself, joy and terror, blessing and curse. And for the Greeks, he represented something terrifyingly irresistible, the loss of control. His birth was as dramatic as his worship. Zeus loved a mortal woman named Semele, daughter of the king of Thebes, but Hera, as always, watched, and her jealousy sparked cruelty. She disguised herself and whispered to Semele that Zeus might not be divine at all. When Semele, desperate for proof, asked Zeus to reveal himself in his true form, he consented, bound by oath. His godly radiance incinerated her instantly, but in her womb lay Dionysus, unborn. Zeus, frantic, saved the child by sewing him into his thigh until the time came. Thus Dionysus was born twice, once from a mortal mother, once from the immortal father's flesh. He was the twice-born god, already different, already liminal. Raised by nymphs, wandering mountains and forests, Dionysus grew into a figure of both joy and dread. He carried a thyasus, a staff wrapped in ivy, tipped with a pine cone, not a weapon of war, but a symbol of wild fertility, of Earth's untamed power. He was followed by satyrs, half men, half beasts, and by maenads, frenzied women who left their homes to dance, drink, and lose themselves in ecstatic frenzy. Where Dionysus went, boundaries broke. Respectable matrons became wild dancers. Servants became queens of the night. Wine flowed. Masks hid identities. Drums thundered through the forests. His worship was liberation and chaos entwined. Wine, for the Greeks, was more than drink. It was transformation. A sip loosened the tongue. A cup warmed the heart. A jug obliterated barriers. In wine, truth came out, sometimes love, sometimes rage. Dionysus embodied this dual edge. Wine as joy, wine as madness. To embrace him was to surrender to both possibilities. His festivals reflected this tension. The Dionysia in Athens was not just a drinking party, but the birthplace of theatre itself. In his honour, tragedies and comedies were performed, masks donned, and collective catharsis sought. The Greeks believed that through theatre, as through wine, one could step outside oneself, become other, face truth through illusion. Dionysus was the patron of art that unsettles, transforms, intoxicates. But he was not gentle. Those who rejected him suffered. King Pentheus of Thebes sneered at the new god, banning his rites. Dionysus, disguised, lured him into spying on the maenads. Inflamed by frenzy, they mistook Pentheus for a beast and tore him limb from limb, his own mother among them. The lesson was brutal. Deny Dionysus, deny ecstasy, and madness will consume you anyway. He was not a god one could ignore. He demanded acknowledgement because he represented forces within the human soul that could not be suppressed forever. Dionysus's myths often place him among outsiders. Women, slaves, foreigners. He welcomed them into his worship, granting release from rigid hierarchies. In his cult, the mighty and the humble danced together, equal in frenzy. This terrified city leaders. For all its joy, Dionysian ritual threatened order. It dissolved distinctions of class, gender, and propriety. Yet that dissolution was also relief. In a world of relentless duty and hardship, Dionysus offered escape. His punishments for defiance were theatrical, almost ironic. A king who resisted him might be driven mad, imagining himself a vine or beast. Another was transformed into a dolphin after mocking the god disguised as a mortal. His wrath was never simple destruction, it was humiliation, the stripping away of dignity. Because what Dionysus hated most was restraint, the denial of one's inner truth. But he also showed compassion. In one tale, he discovered Ariadne abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos. He took her as his bride, crowning her with stars, elevating her from forsaken mortal to immortal queen. To the Greeks, this story revealed Dionysus as savior of the lost, patron of those discarded. He gave joy where there was despair, delight where there was abandonment. Culturally, Dionysus was both beloved and feared. Villages held rural Dionysia in winter, when vines slept, reminding themselves that joy would return. In spring, great festivals shook cities with processions, plays, and revelry. His followers often wore masks, symbolizing the shedding of identity. To participate in Dionysian worship was to step outside yourself, to dissolve into the collective, to feel both release and terror in losing control. Philosophers wrestled with him too. Euripides in the Bacchae dramatized his paradox, the god who liberates yet destroys, whose rites bring joy but also violence. Nietzsche centuries later would call Dionysus the force of chaos, in opposition to Apollo's order, both necessary for art and life. To the Greeks, Dionysus was not optional. He was not simply wine but the spirit of ecstasy, the truth that humans are not rational alone. Even his symbols spoke of duality, ivy and vine, plants that twined and tangled, beautiful but invasive. Leopards and panthers, graceful yet predatory, often drew his chariot. Masks, cups, and drums completed his imagery, all tools of transformation, of frenzy. He was not the polished calm of Olympus, but its wild heartbeat. For ordinary Greeks, Dionysus mattered because he was accessible. You could not call Zeus to your hearth, you could not invite Athena to your table. But Dionysus came in the wine you poured, the play you watched, the laughter that overcame you at a feast. He was both near and overwhelming, intimate and dangerous, yet to deny him was to deny humanity itself. For the Greeks knew that beneath law, duty, and reason lay chaos, desire, rage, grief, ecstasy. Dionysus gave that chaos a name, a ritual, a god. In worshipping him, they admitted that no city, no order, no life could last without release. And so Dionysus wandered their myths, forever young, forever intoxicated, forever terrifying in his joy. Artemis, the untamed huntress. If Dionysus was the embodiment of surrender to frenzy, Artemis was the opposite discipline, distance, and the purity of independence. She was goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, wild animals, and the moon. To mortals, she appeared as a tall, athletic maiden with bow in hand, hounds at her side, and no patience for interruption. She was twin sister to Apollo, born to Leto after one of Hera's long campaigns of jealousy, and from the very moment of her birth, Artemis carried an aura of quiet, implacable strength. Legend says she arrived first, before her brother, and even helped deliver Apollo. A newborn child acting as midwife was already a sign. Artemis would never be bound by ordinary expectations. She swore herself to maidenhood, vowing never to marry, never to yield to the entanglements that ensnared Hera or Aphrodite. She belonged to no man, no lover, no husband. Her life was the forest, the hunt, and the moonlit path. Her independence became sacred. Young girls prayed to her as they came of age, hoping to inherit her purity and strength. Women in childbirth invoked her protection, for though she remained eternally maiden, she oversaw the dangerous passage of birth. Hunters left offerings in the woods before setting out, acknowledging her dominion over the animals they sought. Farmers feared her if they killed without proper reverence, for Artemis's vengeance was swift against those who violated the balance of nature. Her myths often warn mortals against intrusion into her privacy. The most famous is Actaeon, a hunter who stumbled upon Artemis bathing. Furious at his gaze, she transformed him into a stag, and his own hounds tore him apart. The punishment may seem harsh, but to the Greeks it underscored Artemis's role, inviolate, unapproachable, a reminder that boundaries must be respected. She was not the goddess of compromise. She was the cold gleam of moonlight that reveals but does not invite. Yet she was not without compassion. Artemis defended the young and the innocent. She rescued maidens from violence, avenged children harmed unjustly, and guided mortals through forests where dangers lurked. Her worshippers saw her as a protector of purity, not only physical but moral, the purity of being true to oneself, uncorrupted by coercion. Her symbols reflected this clarity: the bow and arrow, precise and distant; the deer, graceful yet untouchable; the moon, cool and luminous, a counterpart to Apollo's blazing sun. Where he radiated warmth and charisma, she exuded calm watchfulness, the serenity of the night sky. Together they formed a balance: day and night, reason and instinct, song and silence. Culturally, Artemis represented a rare model of female autonomy in a patriarchal society. While most goddesses were tied to marriage, fertility, or seduction, Artemis stood apart. She neither married nor mothered. She led her band of companions, nymphs who also swore chastity through forests, running, hunting, living free. In her, the Greeks projected an ideal beyond domestic roles, a vision of fierce self-rule. Unsurprisingly, she was especially revered by women and young girls who prayed for her guidance before stepping into adulthood. Her temples dotted Greece, but one outshone them all: the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Unlike her wild, untamed image, this sanctuary was immense and ordered, with towering columns and lavish decoration. Pilgrims travelled from across the Mediterranean to offer gifts, seeking her protection. Even Alexander the Great, when passing through Ephesus, marvelled at her temple, claiming it was worthy of a goddess who commanded both heaven and wilderness. But Artemis was not always gentle with mortals. When Agamemnon, leader of the Greek army before Troy, killed one of her sacred deer, she halted the winds, stranding his fleet. The only way to appease her was sacrifice of his own daughter, Iphigenia. Some versions say Artemis spared the girl at the last moment, substituting a deer. Others say the sacrifice was completed. Either way, the story revealed her uncompromising nature. Honor her, or pay the price. She was not a goddess to be invoked lightly. Her dual role, protector of life and bringer of death, made her worship complex. She safeguarded women in childbirth, yet also shot her arrows to bring sudden death to women. Apollo did the same with men. This balance of nurture and destruction marked her as a force of nature itself, unpredictable, impartial, serene but deadly. Like the moon, she was distant yet constant, her light both comfort and warning. Philosophically, Artemis symbolized the allure of untamed life. To the Greeks, who built walls, laws, and cities, she was the reminder that beyond their stone boundaries lay wilderness, both dangerous and sacred. She embodied the instinct that resists civilization's weight, the freedom of the forest, the silence of the hunt. To worship Artemis was to admit that humans are not only builders but also creatures of the wild. In art, she was portrayed as youthful, athletic, her garments short to allow freedom of movement. She carried a bow or spear, quiver on her back, hair tied away from her face. Unlike Aphrodite's soft curves or Hera's regal robes, Artemis was lean, active, always ready to move. Artists captured her with stags or hunting dogs, her face serene but watchful, as if listening for footsteps in the brush. Her Roman form, Diana, preserved this wild independence. Later cultures adopted her as goddess of the moon, protector of virgins, and hunter of beasts. She became a symbol of chastity, but also of resilience, her arrows aimed at any who tried to cross her will. The Greeks did not always love her severity, but they respected it. In a pantheon of gods who often blurred boundaries, Zeus violating, Hera punishing, Aphrodite seducing, Artemis stood apart as guardian of inviolate boundaries. Her purity was not fragility but power, the strength to remain untouched, the freedom to roam unclaimed. She was the cold light on a forest path, the snap of a bowstring in silence, the fleeting shadow of a deer. She was Artemis, the untamed huntress, the goddess who answered to no one. Apollo, the golden archer of Olympus. If Artemis was the cold gleam of the moon, Apollo was the blazing brilliance of the sun. Twin siblings, bound by birth yet opposite in nature, they embodied balance, night and day, restraint and radiance, silence and song. Apollo was the god of light, prophecy, music, healing, poetry and archery. He was the golden child of Olympus, radiant and versatile, the one who seemed to hold too many gifts for a single being. To mortals, he appeared as beauty itself. Golden hair, golden bow, golden lyre, golden chariot. He was sunlight given form. But beneath the perfection of Apollo's appearance lay something more volatile. Pride, passion, and the quick sting of grief. Like the sun itself, he could warm or scorch, heal or destroy. His myths reveal not a flawless god, but one consumed by extremes, both adored and feared. Each day, the Greeks imagined Apollo driving the chariot of the sun across the sky, his horses blazing with fire. At dawn, he rose from the east, painting the world with light. At dusk, he descended to the west, dragging shadows behind him. This image, though poetic rather than literal in worship, captured his essence. Apollo was constancy, rhythm, the endless return of day. Yet, like the sun, he could not be gazed upon directly without pain. Apollo's domain was not only physical light, but also the light of knowledge. He was god of prophecy, his greatest shrine, the Oracle of Delphi. There, the Pythia, his priestess, breathed vapours, entered trance, and delivered cryptic messages. Kings, generals, and wanderers alike travelled to Delphi, bearing offerings, desperate for Apollo's guidance. Yet his prophecies were rarely clear. They arrived as riddles, truths tangled in poetry, forcing mortals to interpret their fate. This ambiguity reflected Apollo's nature. He revealed, but not fully. He was illumination tinged with shadow, knowledge laced with uncertainty. His music, too, embodied his brilliance. The lyre he played soothed hearts, charmed gods, and inspired poets. Where Dionysus represented the frenzy of theatre, Apollo embodied harmony and order in art. Together they represented two sides of creation, wild ecstasy and structured beauty. In fact, Greek thinkers often contrasted them: Apollonian clarity against Dionysian chaos, reason against instinct, balance against abandon. Both were necessary, but Apollo was the ideal of proportion, the golden mean, the beauty of measured song. Yet Apollo's love stories betray the limits of his perfection. Though god of music and poetry, he fared poorly in romance. He pursued the nymph Daphne, but when she fled in terror, she begged her father to save her, and he transformed her into a laurel tree. Apollo, heartbroken, made the laurel his sacred symbol, wearing its leaves as crown. In another tale, he loved the prince Hyacinthus. While playing discus, Apollo's throw struck Hyacinthus fatally. In grief, Apollo turned the boy into a flower, the hyacinth, his beauty preserved in bloom, but not in life. These myths reveal the pathos of Apollo. His brilliance could not shield him from loss. In healing, too, he showed duality. Apollo could cure disease, but he could also unleash plague. At the start of Homer's Iliad, Apollo sends a pestilence upon the Greek army after Agamemnon dishonours one of his priests. The god of medicine was also the god of suffering, embodying once again the power of the sunlight that nourishes but also burns. His son, Asclepius, became the god of medicine, taught by Apollo but surpassing him in gentleness. Apollo's pride often tipped into cruelty. When Marsyas, a satyr, challenged him to a contest of music, Apollo played the lyre while Marsyas played the flute. At first, the contest seemed equal, but Apollo demanded they play upside down while singing. Marsyas, unable, lost. For his audacity, Apollo flayed him alive. The tale is gruesome, reminding us that behind the harmony of Apollo's art lay arrogance, the sun's merciless heat. Yet Apollo was not only wrath and grief, He guided heroes, defended cities, and inspired poets. His presence was protective, especially in colonization. Greeks often founded new settlements under his guidance, seeking signs from Delphi before sailing across seas. In this way, Apollo was both cultural and spiritual patron, his influence stretching from temples to theatres, from healing sanctuaries to battlefields. His worship was vast. At Delphi, his temple stood with the inscription "Know thyself, and nothing in excess," reminders of Apollo's ideals: balance, self-awareness, moderation. Yet his myths show he himself often failed these ideals, embodying the very contradictions he taught. This tension made him compelling. He was not abstract perfection but flawed brilliance, radiant yet vulnerable, noble yet dangerous. The Romans embraced him unchanged. Unlike other gods they renamed, to them Apollo remained Apollo, symbol of civilization and light. His imagery, lyre, laurel, bow, radiant youth permeated art, sculpture, and literature. To later ages, he became an archetype of beauty and reason, even as his darker myths lingered in memory. In Greek imagination, Apollo was everywhere. In the sunlit fields, in the healing herbs, in the poetry sung, in the visions of oracles. He was the golden thread woven through life, both inspiration and warning. His presence reminded mortals that beauty and brilliance carry weight, that the sun which warms can also consume. To stand in his light was to feel awe, but also danger. For Apollo was not simply god of harmony. He was the flame that could enlighten or blind, the golden archer whose arrows could heal or kill, the radiant youth whose beauty masked deep grief. In him, the Greeks saw both their highest aspirations and their most fragile vulnerabilities. Hestia, the hearth that holds the world together. If Apollo dazzled as the radiant sun, Hestia glowed more quietly, like embers in a hearth. She was the goddess of the home fire, of domestic peace, of the still flame at the centre of every dwelling and temple. To mortals, she was not a goddess of spectacle. She did not fling thunderbolts, demand sacrifices with fury, or scatter mortals into chaos. Instead, she was presence itself, calm, reliable, necessary. Without her, no family could eat, no city could bind itself in unity, and no temple could keep its sacred fire burning. Her story begins in shadow, swallowed whole like her siblings by Cronus, devoured to prevent the prophecy of his downfall. Later, when Zeus forced Cronus to vomit up his children, Hestia emerged first eldest among the Olympians, and yet paradoxically also the last, because she was the first to be consumed and the last to be released. This strange paradox of being oldest and youngest reflected her nature. She was timeless, beyond hierarchy or rivalry, the one constant in Olympus's tumultuous household. When the gods divided honours among themselves, Hestia refused a throne. Unlike Hera, who wielded regal pride, or Poseidon, who demanded oceans, Hestia simply asked to remain by the hearth, tending the eternal flame. She declined marriage too. Despite suitors as mighty as Poseidon and Apollo, she swore chastity and independence, choosing serenity over drama. In a family rife with betrayal, affairs, and vengeance, she became the goddess who refused chaos. Her domain was not the battlefield or the storm, but the hearth, that simple circle of firestones in every Greek home where bread baked, water boiled, and families gathered. To the Greeks, the hearth was sacred, the centre of life. It was the first place honoured in a new house, where flame was kindled from an existing sacred fire. It was the last thing abandoned in disaster. Even cities carried her presence. In the Prytaneum, the town hall, an eternal flame burned for Hestia, symbolising civic unity. When colonists sailed to found a new settlement, they carried coals from their city's sacred hearth, bringing Hestia's spirit across the sea. She was not only in every home, but in the heart of every polis. Though her myths are fewer than her siblings, her importance lay in her constancy. She was invoked at the beginning and end of sacrifices, no matter which god was honored. A prayer without her name was incomplete. Every meal, every festival, every act of worship began and ended with Hestia. She was the quiet circle that framed divine chaos, the rhythm beneath Olympus's storm. Her symbolism extended beyond the literal flame. To the Greeks, she represented stability, order, continuity, the things without which neither family nor city could survive. Her stillness was not weakness, but endurance. She was the peace that allowed life to flourish, the pause that allowed stories to begin. Where Zeus wielded force and Hera punishment, Hestia embodied gentleness, patience, and care. And yet, even her gentleness had authority. In Homeric hymns, she is called chief among the gods, for though she had no throne, she held the center of Olympus itself. Without her, their feasts could not begin. Without her flame, their temples would be cold stone. She was invisible, yes, but indispensable, perhaps the most indispensable of them all. Her imagery was simple but powerful. Artists did not often depict her in wild scenes, as they did with Athena or Aphrodite. Instead, she appears modest, veiled, serene, holding a branch or flame. She is not dramatic because she does not need to be. Her power is not in spectacle but in presence. Her Roman counterpart, Vesta, reflected this even more strongly. In Rome, the Vestal virgins tended her sacred flame, never allowed to extinguish it, for its death was considered omen of Rome's collapse. Their chastity symbolized purity, their service stability. In Greece, Hestia herself was guardian. In Rome, an entire priesthood embodied her. The idea was the same. The hearth flame was more than fire. It was the living soul of community. Hestia's refusal of drama made her unique among the Olympians. She does not appear in scandals, feuds, or jealousies. No stories of infidelity cling to her, no epic duels or catastrophes. In this absence lies meaning. She was untouched by the chaos of her family, because she represented the place to which one always returned after chaos, the fire at the center, unchanged by storms outside. Her quietness also marked her as the goddess of hospitality. To welcome a guest, a family offered them food cooked on her fire, a seat by her warmth. To refuse hospitality was to dishonor Hestia herself. In this way, she was not just goddess of the home, but of the ethical bonds that held Greek society together. She was kindness, institutionalized, warmth turned divine. And yet, like the hearth flame, she demanded respect. To neglect her fire, to let it go cold, was shameful. To break the rules of hospitality was dangerous. Her wrath did not come in lightning bolts or plagues, but in the collapse of trust, the slow unraveling of bonds. In this sense, her punishment was perhaps more terrifying than others. She did not lash out, she simply withdrew, and without her, society itself cracked. Philosophers recognized her significance. To them, she embodied the axis mundi, the center of the world, the still point around which all else turned. Her hearthfire was not just physical flame but cosmic order, linking gods and mortals, families and cities, earth and Olympus. To light her fire was to affirm connection to the divine fabric of existence. In a family of gods consumed by pride and vengeance, Hestia reminds us that power can be quiet. Her myths may lack bloodshed or spectacle, but her presence shaped every home, every ritual, every city-state. She was not goddess of the storm, but goddess of the shelter against it. She did not start wars, but she ensured there was still a place to which soldiers could return. And perhaps that is why her myths are few. For the Greeks, she was not story but reality, the fire that always burned, the warmth always present, the circle always whole. She did not need adventures because she lived in every meal, every sacrifice, every breath of warmth rising from the hearth. In the end, Hestia was the goddess of endurance. Empires rose and fell, kings schemed and died, heroes fought and were forgotten, but the hearth remained, always burning, always binding. In her flame was continuity across generations. In her silence was strength. She was not the goddess of spectacle but of survival, the one who held Olympus together not by force but by stillness. Persephone, queen of shadows and spring. From the still hearth of Hestia, the tale drifts back into movement, into the shifting rhythm of loss and return. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, is both bloom and wither, both life and death. She embodies the paradox that haunted Greek imagination, that joy always carried the shadow of grief, and death could never entirely silence life. Her story begins as a girl in a meadow, plucking flowers with companions, the grass bent beneath her, the air heavy with spring. In that moment of innocence, the earth split open. From the chasm roared Hades in his black chariot, drawn by horses darker than night. He seized her, pulled her screaming into the underworld, and the earth closed above. To mortals, it seemed sudden. To the gods, it was fate arranged by Zeus, her father, who silently allowed his brother to take her. Demeter's grief scorched the world. For 9 days and nights she searched, her torches burning, her tears watering barren soil. When she learned the truth, her grief transformed into vengeance. She refused to let crops grow, plunging mortals into famine. Even the gods trembled, for without human offerings, Olympus itself weakened. Zeus, who had permitted the abduction, was forced to act, but rules bound even gods. Persephone had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds in Hades' realm. To eat in the underworld was to bind oneself to it. The compromise was struck. She would spend half the year with her mother, half with her husband. With each return, Demeter rejoiced, and spring exploded in colour. With each descent, Demeter mourned, and winter followed. Thus Persephone became the embodiment of the seasons, her absence the frost, her presence the bloom. Yet her myth is not only a story of loss. Over time, Persephone herself transformed. At first, she was the victim, the flower plucked too soon. But as queen of the underworld, she grew into something more, a sovereign, calm and firm, seated beside Hades on a throne of obsidian. Mortals began to pray not only to Hades but to her, seeking mercy, safe passage, or hope of renewal. She was no longer only daughter. She became ruler, judge, and guide. The Greeks saw in her dual role the truth of existence. Life and death were not opposites but cycles, bound together. Persephone carried flowers in one hand and shadows in the other. In her, mortals recognized their own fate, to rise, to fall, to return. Her cult reflected this duality. At Eleusis, in the great mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, initiates experienced rites so secret they were never written down. What is known is this: through symbolic descent and return, through ritual silence and revelation, worshippers sought hope in the face of death. Persephone was not only a reminder of mortality, but a promise of continuity. Just as she returned from the underworld each spring, so too might the soul find renewal. To the Greeks, who feared death deeply, Persephone's myth offered solace. Her imagery shifted depending on season. In spring, she appeared as maiden, crowned with flowers, her arms full of blossoms, radiant and gentle. In winter, she was queen, clad in dark robes, seated beside Hades, serene and stern. Artists captured both, sometimes blending them. A young woman with a wreath of grain and a pomegranate in hand, her smile quiet but unreadable. She was both light and shadow, innocence and authority. Philosophers considered her too. Plato used her descent as metaphor for the soul's journey falling into darkness, but destined for light. Later writers interpreted her as symbol of transformation, the necessary passage through grief to find wisdom. Even in modern thought, her tale resonates as myth of change, childhood to adulthood, innocence to power, life to death. But for the Greeks, her meaning was visceral. Every harvest echoed her loss, every spring her return, every funeral carried whispers of her name. Families prayed for her mercy as souls entered her realm, hoping she would soften Hades' judgment. Farmers poured libations in her honor, begging for crops to return. Women, especially, identified with her taken, silenced yet rising into power. She was paradox, but paradox made sacred. Even her fruit, the pomegranate, became symbol. Its seeds bound her to death, yet its red juice mirrored life's pulse. To eat was to accept mortality, but also fertility, continuity, the cycle that never ends. In weddings, pomegranates were offered as tokens of fertility. In funerals, they marked the passage of souls. Persephone's fruit was both cradle and coffin. Hades, often misunderstood, was not depicted as cruel husband in every version. Some traditions describe their union as stable, even affectionate. Persephone, over time, is no longer helpless but partner, ruling with authority. In this light, her story becomes less abduction and more transformation. From girl of flowers to queen of eternity, her worship carried this nuance. Women especially prayed to her not only for crops but for resilience, the strength to endure separation, the courage to rise again after grief. She became the goddess of second chances, of renewal after devastation. And so her myth endured not simply as explanation for seasons, but as mirror of human survival. Where Demeter symbolized maternal devotion, Persephone symbolized growth through trial. Where Hades embodied inevitability, Persephone embodied hope within inevitability. Together, they balanced life's terror with life's promise. Her presence lingered in art, in ritual, in whispered prayers at gravesides. She was the goddess who descended and returned, who walked through darkness and carried light back. For the Greeks, no myth was more intimate, for no truth was more pressing than this, that all must descend, but perhaps, like Persephone, the soul might also rise. Persephone was the flower and the seed, the maiden and the queen, the smile and the silence. She was the paradox the Greeks could not resolve and did not need to, for in her they saw not contradiction, but the cycle of life itself, unbroken and eternal. Eros and Psyche, love's ordeal. From the shadows of Persephone's realm, the story bends toward another figure who straddled mortal fragility and divine entanglement, Psyche. Her tale was different from the Olympians, for she began not as a goddess, but as a mortal girl, one whose beauty grew into a curse. Among all the myths the Greeks and Romans whispered, hers carried the intimacy of love betrayed, tested, and reborn, the sort of tale that blurred the line between myth and parable. Psyche was born a princess, daughter of a king whose other children married into noble families without difficulty. Yet Psyche, despite, or rather because of her breathtaking beauty, found herself alone. Word of her loveliness spread so far that strangers came not to worship Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, but to kneel before Psyche as if she were divine. Temples once crowded with offerings to the goddess fell silent, their garlands placed instead at the feet of this mortal girl. To the common eye, it seemed flattery. To Aphrodite, it was an insult so deep it burned like acid. The goddess of desire, of allure itself, would not tolerate a rival born of flesh and blood. Aphrodite's wrath took form in her son, Eros, the god of love. Armed with his quiver of arrows, he had made kings love slaves, queens love strangers, enemies fall helplessly into each other's arms. His power was not tender, but disruptive, love rendered as compulsion, as chaos. Aphrodite commanded him to make Psyche fall in love with the most wretched creature alive, a punishment through degradation. But when Eros descended and gazed upon Psyche in her sleep, he faltered. His arrow pricked his own flesh, and for the first time the god of love himself became ensnared. Meanwhile, Psyche's life withered. No suitors came. Men admired her from a distance, whispered prayers to her beauty, but none dared to claim her hand. Her parents, distraught, sought the wisdom of an oracle. The response was cruel. Psyche was destined not for a mortal husband, but for a monstrous bridegroom who awaited her on a mountain peak. With heavy hearts, her family prepared her like a sacrifice, sending her to her fate. Yet when she was carried to the mountain top, the story shifted. A gentle wind lifted her, bearing her not to a beast's jaws, but to a palace of wonders. Invisible servants guided her steps, Food appeared, fragrant and rich. And at night, a voice came to her in the dark, her husband, unseen, his presence warm but hidden. He treated her with tenderness, yet he begged one thing: never try to see his face. Love without sight became her life, and slowly she yielded to its strangeness, falling for the voice, the laughter, the touches in shadow. But human curiosity gnaws. When her sisters came to visit, they poisoned her trust. How can you love a man you have never seen? What if he is monstrous, deceiving you? Psyche, already restless, broke. One night she lit a lamp, leaned over her sleeping husband, and saw not a monster but Eros himself, radiant, winged, the god of love. Yet, as she gazed, a drop of hot oil from her lamp fell upon his shoulder, waking him. Betrayed, he vanished, leaving Psyche in ruin. Her journey of redemption began with despair. Alone, bereft of palace and lover, she wandered, praying to the gods. At last she dared to approach Aphrodite herself, begging for mercy. The goddess, delighted at the chance to torment her rival, set her a series of impossible tasks. The first was to sort a mountain of seeds, barley, millet, beans, lentils by nightfall. It was a task designed for failure. But as Psyche knelt in hopelessness, an army of ants swarmed forth, dividing each grain into perfect piles. By dawn, the task was done. The second trial sent her to gather golden fleece from deadly rams that gored any who came near. Again, she despaired, until a river spirit whispered counsel: wait until the beasts rested at dusk, then collect the fleece caught in brambles. She obeyed and returned alive. The third task demanded water from the Styx, the dreadful river of oaths in the underworld. No mortal could descend its cliffs, but Zeus's eagle, pitying her, seized the vessel and filled it with the dark water. The final trial was the cruelest: descend into Hades itself, to Persephone, and return with a box containing a portion of her beauty. With courage born of desperation, Psyche entered the underworld, bribing Cerberus with barley cakes, offering coins to Charon for passage, and returning with the box sealed. But curiosity, always her undoing, tempted her again. Believing the beauty within might win back Eros, she opened it. Instead of radiance, a cloud of underworld sleep overcame her, and she collapsed lifeless. It might have been her end, but Eros had not forgotten. Though wounded by betrayal, his love endured. He descended, brushed the sleep from her with his arrows, and awakened her with a kiss. Moved by their trials, Zeus himself intervened, granting Psyche ambrosia, making her immortal. At last, she and Eros were wed, not as god and mortal, but as equals. From their union came a daughter, Hedone, goddess of pleasure, delight born from the marriage of love and soul. The myth carried meanings that stretched far beyond romance. Psyche's name itself means soul, and her tale became a story of the soul tested by doubt, temptation, and suffering before finding eternal union with love. The tasks she endured, sorting chaos, gathering what is dangerous, descending to the underworld, mirrored the struggles every soul must face. In her, mortals saw themselves, fragile, flawed, curious, but capable of growth through endurance. Culturally, her story carried weight in both Greece and later Rome. The Eleusinian mysteries whispered of Persephone's descent and return as hope for life after death. Psyche's journey echoed this theme, a mortal's soul surviving trial and achieving immortality. Her marriage to Eros bridged human and divine, suggesting that even mortal weakness could transform into something eternal. In art, Psyche was often shown with butterfly wings, symbol of transformation, of fragile beauty becoming resilient. She is one of the few mortals elevated not only to Olympus but into philosophical metaphor. Even today, psychology takes its name from her psyche as soul, as mind, as the hidden self that must endure trials before understanding love. Her myth is tender and brutal at once. Tender in the devotion that overcame betrayal, brutal in the cruelty of Aphrodite's jealousy and the suffering demanded of a mortal girl. Yet its endurance lies in its truth. Love is not simple. It is tested, doubted, wounded, but when it survives, it becomes unbreakable. In the end, Psyche's ordeal gave her more than a husband. It gave her transformation. She began as beauty without love, adored, but untouched. She ended as goddess of the soul, her trials carved into eternity. To mortals, her tale whispered this, that even through despair, even through the darkest trials, the soul can rise again, remade by love. Medusa, monster, victim, and mirror. From Psyche's redemption, the story drifts into darker territory, into a myth where beauty became punishment and survival became weapon. Medusa, unlike most figures of Greek mythology, stands at the edge of terror and pity. To many she was the Gorgon, serpent-haired, whose gaze turned men to stone. But to look more closely is to see not only a monster, but a victim reshaped into a mirror of divine cruelty. She was born mortal among immortals. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were Gorgons too, but they could not die. Medusa alone was vulnerable, flesh and blood, capable of ending. Yet she was also strikingly beautiful. Her hair flowed like rivers of midnight silk, her eyes calm as the sea before a storm. From youth she chose devotion. She entered Athena's temple as priestess, vowing chastity and service to the goddess of wisdom and war. In that sanctuary of marble and silence, she swept the floors, lit incense, whispered prayers before dawn. For a time, she seemed untouchable, a figure of grace whose beauty only deepened in sacred restraint. But beauty is rarely safe in Greek myth. Poseidon, lord of the seas, saw her and burned with desire. He did not court, he did not ask. He entered Athena's temple and violated Medusa upon the goddess's very altar. The crime was his, but Athena's fury fell on Medusa. Perhaps the goddess of wisdom could not bear her sanctuary defiled. Perhaps she could not strike Poseidon directly. Perhaps, like so many myths, the tale reflected the bitter injustice women bore in silence. Whatever the reason, Athena punished the victim. With a single gesture, she transformed Medusa's flowing hair into serpents, her soft gaze into a weapon that petrified all who met it. From that moment, Medusa's life fractured. Banished from temple and city, she wandered into exile. Wherever she went, the land became littered with statues, men who came to slay her, who underestimated her curse, who froze in terror at the last moment. Her cave at the edge of the world became both prison and fortress, filled with stone fragments of would-be conquerors. She wept at first, but over time the tears dried. The snakes coiled like guardians, whispering in restless hisses, her only companions. Heroes sought her as prize. Perseus was the one destined to succeed, armed not with courage alone but with divine gifts. Hermes' winged sandals, Athena's mirrored shield, Hades' helm of invisibility, a blade sharp enough to pierce anything. The gods who had cursed Medusa gave the weapons to destroy her. When Perseus found her, she was asleep. She did not lunge, did not roar. She lay curled in her cave, vulnerable, perhaps dreaming of the temple where she once prayed. Guided by the reflection in his shield, Perseus struck, severing her head in silence. But her power did not end with her breath. From her neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a golden-sworded giant children of Poseidon, hidden until her death. Even in ruin, life spilled from her. Perseus carried her head, its gaze still lethal, as weapon. He used it to slay monsters, to turn enemies to stone, to humiliate rivals. At last he gifted it to Athena, who placed it upon her shield, the Aegis, turning Medusa into eternal instrument of war. Thus the paradox. The goddess who cursed her now wore her face. Medusa's image, once beauty punished, became weapon of empire, carved into temples, shields, coins. Soldiers marched beneath her snarling visage, invoking her terror to frighten enemies. She became symbol, stripped of voice, her trauma weaponized into divine power. And yet, Beneath this official story, whispers endured. In villages, women left offerings at caves, small clay serpents, locks of hair, prayers murmured in darkness. They did not see her as monster, but as guardian of the wronged. Her gaze, they believed, did not only petrify, it protected. To hang her image over a door was to ward off evil. To wear her face on amulets was to deflect harm. She became apotropaic. Her terror turned to shield against terror. Art preserved both sides. On temple pediments she appeared grotesque, tongue lolling, eyes bulging, hair alive with serpents. But on pottery and sculpture, some artists rendered her almost human, still sad, beautiful. Her curse not yet complete. Roman mosaics often placed her head at the center, a protective emblem, the eye that sees all, turning back misfortune. In Byzantium, her face lingered on walls and floors, silent guardian of thresholds. Across centuries she endured, less as monster than as mirror, reflecting whatever society feared most. Culturally, Medusa became symbol of inversion. In patriarchal myth, she was cast as beast to be slain. In hidden memory, she was woman wronged, silenced, yet enduring. Modern eyes often read her differently. Not villain, but victim transformed into weapon by gods who could not face their own failings. She was rage made flesh, trauma turned to power. Her snakes, once curse, now appear as crown. Her gaze, once horror, now resistance. And Perseus? His heroism is complicated. He did not slay a beast rampaging through villages, but a woman sleeping in exile. He carried her severed head as trophy, never once questioning why she had been cursed. His victory became glory, her story became silence. Yet even within that silence, her presence haunted him. Some later tales whisper that he dreamed of her, that her face in the shield's reflection lingered not as triumph but as sorrow. Medusa's myth, more than most, exposes the cruelty beneath divine order. A woman punished for another's violence, a victim recast as villain, a monster slain in sleep. And yet, from this injustice, her image endured stronger than her slayers. Perseus is remembered, yes, but Medusa's face stares still from marble, bronze, canvas, and imagination. She outlived him in symbol, her eyes unblinking long after his story dimmed. Her endurance lies in paradox. She is both curse and cure, horror and protector, victim and emblem of defiance. She shows that monsters are often made, not born, and that to call someone a monster may be the most effective way to silence them. Yet silence does not erase. In every retelling, Medusa's eyes return, challenging, questioning, who truly is the monster? To the Greeks, her myth warned against hubris, against gazing unprepared into the face of terror. To us, it warns something else, to look again, to ask whose story is being told, and why. Medusa remains the most dangerous of all the gods' creations, not because she turned men to stone, but because she refuses to be forgotten. She was priestess, victim, exile, monster, mother, weapon, symbol. She was Medusa, not only the Gorgon but the mirror, reflecting gods and men alike, showing them what they would rather not see. Hecate, guardian of crossroads and witchcraft. Not all the powers the Greeks revered sat upon golden thrones atop Olympus. Some lingered in liminal spaces, half in shadow, half in light, presiding over the places where certainty broke apart into uncertainty. Among these was Hecate, the goddess of crossroads, of thresholds, of torches and hounds, of moonlight flickering against the edges of darkness. To most mortals, she was not a radiant figure like Apollo or Aphrodite. She was a whisper, a presence felt when walking alone at night, when a choice loomed with no clear path, when the air smelled of smoke and mystery. Hecate's origins were older than Olympus itself. In Hesiod's Theogony, she is described not as a daughter of Zeus, but as a Titaness, daughter of Perses and Asteria, who somehow survived the fall of her kin. Zeus, far from punishing her as he did other titans, honored her, granting her dominion over earth, sea, and sky. This broad rule made her unique. She was not bound to one element but moved freely through them, slipping where others could not. And perhaps that is why she became associated with thresholds, because she was never confined. Crossroads were her domain. In the Greek imagination, these places were not simple intersections of dirt paths, but symbolic doorways, where choices diverged, where spirits wandered, where the living and dead brushed shoulders. Offerings were left at these crossings, cakes of honey, bread, eggs, fish known as Hecate's suppers. Dogs, sacred to her, howled at night as if warning of her presence. To walk at a crossroads after dark was to step into her realm, where destinies bent and unseen forces prowled. She carried torches, guiding or terrifying depending on her mood. With them she lit the way for Persephone when the maiden first returned from Hades, her flickering flames a comfort in the gloom. But the same torches might blind or confuse, throwing shadows across walls, making mortals see shapes where none stood. In this way, Hecate was both protector and trickster. She could illuminate or obscure, depending on what she believed fate required. Her presence was not confined to crossroads alone. She was invoked in witchcraft and necromancy. Her name whispered in spells scratched upon lead tablets or murmured over herbs gathered at midnight. Sorceresses like Medea and Circe, famed in myth for their potions and curses, were said to draw their power from Hecate's favour. To call on her was to tap into forces older than Zeus's lightning, primal powers bound to earth and moon. She stood at the edge of Greek religion, where ritual bled into fear and piety merged with superstition. But Hecate was not only feared, she was guardian too. Mothers prayed to her during childbirth, a threshold between life and death. Farmers offered her first fruits, hoping she would bless their harvest. She was invoked at city gates as protector against plague and invasion. Her role was ambiguous, both dread and safety, curse and shield. And perhaps that made her more real to mortals than the shining Olympians, for she reflected the truth of life itself, uncertain, contradictory, never entirely safe. Art portrayed her in strange ways. Sometimes she appeared as a single woman, cloaked and veiled, bearing torches, but more often she was triple-bodied, facing three directions at once, a living embodiment of the crossroads. Each face saw a different path. Each hand carried a torch, a key, or a dagger. To stand before her statue was to feel judged by three gazes, as though no secret could be hidden. Ritually, her worship was quiet but enduring. The Athenians honoured her at city gates, leaving offerings at new moons. In rural villages, she was a constant presence in household shrines, invoked at night with whispered prayers. While Zeus demanded sacrifices of oxen and Apollo gleamed in marble temples, Hecate lived in the everyday acts of fear and gratitude, in the hush of footsteps at midnight, in the small food left at the edge of a path. Her association with the dead grew stronger over time. Ghosts were said to roam with her, spirits of those unburied or unjustly killed, following her torches like moths to flame. Dogs, too, were tied to her, sacrificed in her honour, or said to howl when she approached. Even today, the image of a black dog at night retains its chill, a fragment of her myth lingering in collective memory. And yet, despite this ominous aura, Hecate was not evil. The Greeks did not see her as a demon, but as necessity, the force of in-betweenness, of choices, of the unknown that lay just beyond human sight. She reminded mortals that not every road was straight, not every truth simple. She embodied ambiguity itself, and in doing so, demanded respect. Philosophers later interpreted her as symbol of liminality, the point where opposites meet, where light becomes shadow, where life tilts toward death. Mystics invoked her as guide through transformation, through the inner crossroads of the soul. To follow Hecate was to accept uncertainty, to step into darkness, trusting the torch might reveal enough to move forward. Her story reflects something essential about Greek belief. For all their gods of order and reason, the Greeks knew that life was never fully ordered. Beneath the polished marble of Apollo's temples, beneath Athena's sharp wisdom, there was always the unease of night, the choices unmade, the roads untravelled. Hecate was the goddess of that unease, the whisper that kept mortals cautious, reverent, aware that their world brushed against unseen forces at every step. So when the wind shifts at a lonely crossroad, when dogs howl at nothing, when shadows stretch longer than they should, the Greeks believed it was her, Hecate, standing at the threshold, torches raised, eyes watching in three directions, reminding mortals that paths always branch, that fate always waits, and that choices always carry unseen weight. Nemesis, the goddess of vengeance and balance. If Hecate stood at the edge of night with her torches, Nemesis waited further still, where pride turned to downfall, where unchecked fortune collapsed into ruin. She was the goddess of vengeance, yes, but more precisely of balance, the inescapable force that corrected excess, ensuring that hubris, the great crime of overreaching mortals, never went unanswered. Her name itself meant to give what is due. To call upon her was to summon the scales, the cosmic reminder that the universe tolerated arrogance only for so long. The Greeks feared hubris more than almost any sin. It was not simple pride, but the act of placing oneself above gods, above fate, above mortal limits. Kings who boasted too loudly, generals who took too much glory, lovers who scorned divine order, all risked Nemesis's gaze. She was not fiery like Ares or cruel like Hera. She was inevitable, slow, and precise. She waited until the right moment, then struck with elegance, like a stone dropped into water, ripples spreading outward until an empire trembled. Her most famous tale is the story of Narcissus. He was a youth of surpassing beauty, so enchanting that others fell helplessly in love with him. But Narcissus scorned them all, mocking their devotion, caring only for himself. One rejected lover prayed for justice, and Nemesis answered. She lured Narcissus to a pool, where he gazed into his reflection. Captivated by his own image, he wasted away, unable to turn from the beauty he could never possess. From his death grew a flower, delicate, white and gold, the Narcissus. It was not Apollo's wrath, nor Aphrodite's jealousy, but Nemesis's quiet hand that balanced the scales, turning arrogance into self-destruction. Nemesis appeared in countless whispers of myth. She punished arrogant kings who ignored sacrifices, soldiers who boasted of invincibility, mortals who dared compare themselves to gods. No one was too mighty to escape her. In some stories, she was said to be the mother of Helen of Troy, conceived after Zeus, in swan form, pursued Nemesis, and she laid an egg from which Helen hatched. Even this tangled myth connects her to balance. For Helen's beauty, which sparked the Trojan War, became a reminder of how desire and arrogance could topple entire civilizations. Her imagery was stark. She was often depicted with a measuring rod, a set of scales, or a bridle to restrain excess. Sometimes she carried a sword or a wheel, symbol of fate's turning. In her hand, justice was not compassion but correction. She was not invoked to bless but to restrain. Where mortals asked for prosperity from Demeter or safety from Zeus, they prayed to Nemesis to spare them, to let their fortune remain without backlash, to keep their success from drawing her attention. Her cult was strongest at Rhamnus, northeast of Athens, where a great temple and colossal statue honored her. Carved of Parian marble, it showed her crowned with deer and holding a branch of apple blossoms, symbols of measure and consequence. Pilgrims came not to celebrate, but to acknowledge her power, leaving offerings so that their fortunes might not twist into their downfall. In war, soldiers feared her more than the enemy, for boasting of certain victory often brought Nemesis's hand. The idea of her presence shaped daily life. Greeks learned to temper joy with modesty, to veil success with humility, to flaunt wealth, to boast of strength, to laugh too loudly at the gods was to invite her. She was not a goddess who demanded constant worship, but one who loomed like a shadow over every celebration, reminding mortals to bow their heads even in triumph. The poets used her as lesson. Tragedies are full of Nemesis's echo heroes who rise too high only to fall in ruin. Oedipus, who sought to outwit prophecy, was crushed not by chance but by the principle she embodied. Agamemnon, proud of his conquest, returned to betrayal and blood. These stories did not always name Nemesis outright, but her logic was always present. What rises too far must fall. Yet she was not hated. She was respected, even necessary. The Greeks knew that without balance, chaos reigned. A world without Nemesis was one where tyrants thrived unchecked, where arrogance never met consequence. Her presence, though feared, was reassurance that the universe was not blind. She did not strike the humble nor the grateful. She struck only those who forgot their place, who believed themselves untouchable. Her Roman counterpart, Invidia, became the spirit of envy, but the Greeks never reduced Nemesis to petty jealousy. She was larger than human emotion. She was the embodiment of cosmic law, the correction inscribed into the bones of the universe. Even the gods were not fully free from her. Some stories whispered that Zeus himself honoured her boundaries, wary of overstepping, lest Nemesis turn even her eyes upon him. In this way, Nemesis represented one of the deepest Greek truths, that life was fragile, fortune fleeting, and every excess carried its price. Temples might celebrate victory, but shrines to Nemesis reminded all that tomorrow the wheel could turn. And so, when the Greeks stood at festivals, crowned with wreaths, drinking in triumph, they poured out libations to her, murmuring prayers that their joy not tip into arrogance. When generals marched home, they walked humbly, eyes lowered, lest Nemesis see pride and bring disaster. She was not worshipped in laughter, but in caution. She was the whisper in every victory. Remember, this too will pass. Do not provoke the balance. The Furies. Voices of eternal justice. If Nemesis embodied balance, restoring measure to arrogance, the Furies were harsher, still spirits born not to correct pride, but to hound blood guilt, to claw at the consciences of those who spilled kindred blood. They were called the Erinyes, the angry ones, and their name alone was enough to chill the air in Greek imagination. Where Olympians dined on nectar and argued in golden halls, the Furies lurked below, in the black soil, in the cries of the murdered, in the restless silence of graves that had not been honoured. Their origin was older than Olympus, older even than many titans. When Cronus castrated his father Uranus, and the blood of the sky god dripped onto the earth, from those drops rose the Furies born from primal violence, from mutilation and betrayal. They were not gods of order or light, but of memory, of wounds that demanded reckoning. They hunted those who betrayed family bonds, sons who slew fathers, mothers who murdered children, brothers who betrayed brothers. In their eyes, these crimes poisoned the very soil of human life, and no man, no king, no supplication could escape their pursuit. They were depicted as terrifying figures, women with serpents for hair, eyes dripping blood, wings of bats or blackened leather, whips of bronze in their hands. Their voices were shrieks, piercing the air like iron dragged across stone. Poets described them as relentless, without pity, hounding their victims not only in the world but in the mind. For the Furies did not always kill. More often they drove the guilty into madness, turning their own minds into prisons. The most famous tale of their pursuit is the saga of Orestes. After Agamemnon returned from Troy, he was murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, in vengeance for the sacrifice of their daughter, Iphigenia. When Orestes grew to manhood, he faced the terrible command of Apollo to avenge his father by killing his mother. He obeyed, striking her down, but in that moment blood answered blood, and the Furies rose. They swarmed upon him, shrieking, their torches blazing, their eyes unblinking. He fled across Greece, sleepless, broken, his mind unravelling, for they pursued not his body alone but his very sanity. It was only when Athena herself intervened, establishing a court at Athens to try him, that the Furies were stayed. The trial of Orestes marked a turning point in Greek imagination, the birth of justice through law rather than blood vengeance. When the jury was tied, Athena cast her vote for mercy. The Furies, enraged, threatened to poison the land with their wrath, but Athena offered them honour instead. She gave them a new role as the Eumenides, the kindly ones, guardians of civic order. Thus vengeance was transformed into justice, fury into law. Yet their presence remained, haunting every oath, reminding every juror and every king that blood once spilled never vanished without answer. In ritual, the Furies were feared more than worshipped. Offerings of black sheep were given to appease them, libations poured into the earth rather than sky. Their shrines were often hidden, near caves or burial grounds, far from the glittering temples of Olympus. Mortals prayed not for their blessings but for their absence, begging them to turn their eyes elsewhere, to spare their households from madness. Yet even in their dread, the Furies carried meaning. They represented conscience, the inescapable weight of guilt. The Greeks knew that to kill was not only to end life, but to rupture the bonds of kinship, to stain the soul. The Furies were that stain made flesh. In Aeschylus's plays they hiss and chant, their voices echoing as the inner torment of Orestes himself. They are less monsters than embodiments of memory, of the truth that no one escapes what they have done. Artists depicted them rarely, perhaps fearing to give them too much shape. When they did appear, it was often in groups of three, faces twisted, snakes writhing at their temples. Sometimes they were winged, descending upon the guilty like storms. Other times they were cloaked, lurking at the edge of torchlight. Their very ambiguity was power, for to name them, to see them, was to admit one's own fear of what lay unatoned in the heart. And the Greeks did fear them deeply, but also understood their necessity. Without the Furies, vengeance would spiral unchecked, crimes would go unanswered, kinship bonds would fray into nothing. By embodying wrath, they contained it. By punishing blood crimes, they preserved the fragile order of family and city. They were terror, but they were also structure. Even later, philosophers found meaning in them. Plato spoke of the soul tormented by its own wrongs, as though the Furies were nothing more than inner voices. Roman poets made them instruments of fate, sent from the underworld to remind emperors that power could not wash away guilt. In every retelling they remained the same, not gods to be adored, but forces to be endured. And so, in the hush of night, when guilt pressed too heavily, when dreams twisted into nightmares of pursuit, the Greeks believed it was the Furies whispering. They could not be bribed, they could not be silenced, they could only be faced. And even then, their shrieking never fully ceased. For once guilt is born, it lingers forever, a shadow following every step, a chorus that cannot be unlearned. Typhon, the monster who challenged Olympus. For all their power, the Olympian gods lived with one shadow always pressing at their golden gates, the fear that chaos might return. The Titans had been defeated, their father Cronus overthrown, their grandfather Uranus long cast into memory. Yet the earth itself, Gaia, who had borne them all, still stirred with rage at how her children had been cast down. From her grief and fury, and from Tartarus the abyss itself came a new child, the most terrible of all. His name was Typhon. No creature in Greek imagination loomed larger. He was no mere monster like a lion with a serpent's tail or a giant with a club. Typhon was Apocalypse given form. Hesiod described him as so vast that his head brushed the stars. His body was human-like only in outline, but his arms stretched across the horizon. Where his legs should have been, coils of serpents writhed, hissing with venom. His eyes blazed with fire. His voice roared with 100 sounds. Sometimes a lion's roar, sometimes a bull's bellow, sometimes a cacophony of shrieking serpents. Flames shot from his mouth. Winds whipped about him as if storms themselves were his cloak. Zeus had seized the throne of heaven after a long war against the Titans, but Typhon was something different. He was not old order, but raw chaos, Earth's attempt to strike back at the usurpers. When he rose from the land of Cilicia, even the gods trembled. Many fled to Egypt, disguising themselves as animals. Myth later explained why the Egyptians worshipped gods with animal heads. Only Zeus stood his ground. He could not run, for if Typhon won, all order, law, justice, oaths would collapse. The world would fall back into storm and fire. The battle between Zeus and Typhon was nothing less than cosmic. They hurled mountains at each other. Rivers boiled, seas heaved, forests burned. Zeus's thunderbolts clashed against Typhon's storm winds and flaming breath. The earth shook so violently that mortals imagined the sky itself might fall. For a time, Typhon gained the upper hand. Some versions say he even wounded Zeus, slicing the sinews from his hands and feet, leaving him powerless. Hermes and Pan recovered them, allowing Zeus to rise again, but the humiliation lingered. The king of the gods had almost been undone. When Zeus rallied, his fury was beyond measure. With all his thunderbolts blazing, he struck Typhon again and again, driving him back. Finally, he crushed him beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, where the monster's body writhed, imprisoned under rock. The volcano's fire and eruptions were said to be Typhon's breath, his fury seeping through the mountain. Every tremor, every plume of smoke, every river of lava was a reminder that chaos was not destroyed, only bound. The myth of Typhon carried weight far beyond its monstrous imagery. To the Greeks, he was not just a fire-breathing giant. He was the embodiment of natural catastrophe, earthquakes, storms, eruptions, forces beyond human control. To explain the sudden terror of the earth shaking or the mountains spitting fire, they told of Typhon, still struggling beneath the stones, his roars echoing through the earth. In this way, the myth was not fantasy but explanation, a story to give meaning to the unexplainable. But Typhon also carried symbolic meaning. He was chaos itself, the unshaped raw power that threatened to undo order. Zeus's victory was not just personal triumph, but the triumph of structure over disorder, of law over anarchy. Yet the story admitted that order was fragile. Zeus could be wounded, the gods could flee, chaos could rise again. Typhon's presence reminded mortals and immortals alike that stability was never guaranteed, it had to be defended. Artists struggled to depict him. On vases, he appears with wings, serpents for legs, and a grotesque, towering form. In mosaics, he often rises like a whirlwind, part man, part beast, part storm. No two images are alike, reflecting his very nature, shapeless, impossible to define, always too much. He was the what-if that haunted Greek imagination. What if order collapsed? What if the gods failed? What if the earth itself turned against them? His legacy seeped into culture. Romans inherited him, naming him Typhoeus, connecting him with their own tales of monstrous storms. Philosophers used him as metaphor, describing tyrants as typhons in flesh, men whose greed and cruelty threatened the order of cities, as Typhon had threatened Olympus. Even poets centuries later invoked him to describe political upheaval, war, or disaster. He was the ever-present storm on the horizon. And in the shadow of Etna, villagers lived with his breath. They saw his anger in fire, his roar in earthquakes, his sigh in hot winds. To them, he was not a story from the past, but a reality still rumbling under their feet. Sacrifices were made not to honor him, but to keep him bound, to appease the gods who held him down. In the grand arc of myth, Typhon was defeated, but never gone. His presence lingered as a warning. For though Zeus ruled Olympus with lightning and law, chaos was always one eruption away, one storm away, one trembling earth away. Typhon remained, the scar under the skin of creation, the reminder that no order lasts forever without vigilance. And so the Greeks told his story not just to entertain, but to explain, to remember, to caution. He was the monster who nearly toppled heaven, the fire beneath the mountain, the chaos under every fragile piece. Typhon, the nightmare Gaia birthed in her anger, lay buried, but never silent. And now, after wandering so long through Olympus, shadowed caves, and firelit battlefields, the journey slows. The gods, monsters, and mortals we have walked beside grow distant, their voices softening into the hush of memory. Zeus with his thunder, Hera with her fury, Poseidon with his restless tides, Athena's wisdom, Hades' stillness, Aphrodite's allure, Nemesis's balance. The Furies' shrieking justice, each one a strand woven into the tapestry of ancient thought. Together, they do not simply tell stories. They reflect the fears, hopes, and questions of a people who looked at a world both beautiful and cruel, and filled it with divine faces. The Greeks did not see their myths as mere entertainment. They were explanations, warnings, comforts. A thunderstorm was not just weather, it was Zeus reminding mortals of order. A sudden wind at night carried Hecate's torch. The tremble of the earth was Typhon shifting beneath the mountain. The pang of conscience was the Furies whispering. And every joy, every grief, every choice felt tethered to unseen hands, the Moirai weaving threads, Atropos waiting with her shears. Yet for all their grandeur, these tales echo something deeply human, love tested and restored in Psyche, grief reshaping the world in Demeter, pride undone by Nemesis, innocence twisted into legend in Medusa. Each myth is less about gods and more about us, our choices, our doubts, our longing to make sense of suffering, our desire to believe there is meaning even in pain. So, as the lights dim and the world grows quiet, let the gods slip back into the shadows where they belong. Let the thunder soften, the serpents curl into silence, the fates return to their loom. For tonight you have walked among immortals, and now, gently, you may close your eyes, knowing their stories will wait until you wish to dream them again.